Where the Left Goes Wrong, Part 2. We're continuing off right where we left off in Part 1, so go watch Part 1 if you haven't. We ended Part 1 emphasizing that one of the biggest blind spots of leftists is that they don't appreciate how attached people are, especially conservatives, who are in the majority of people, how attached they are to their culture, to their national identity, and so forth, and to basically the traditional way of living life. This is what we might call culture. And now this brings us to the next point, which is LGBTQ plus issues. The left goes wrong by pushing this too far. Now, of course, there's a legitimate essence behind LGBTQ plus, which is that we want to be much more tolerant and kinder towards people who are non-cis, let's say, who are gay, who are trans, who are whatever other kind of, non-standard identifications. That's all well and good. However, this can be taken too far. And what the left doesn't understand about this issue is how deeply it freaks out people on the right, and just not even people on the right, but moderates as well. It's not just extreme right-wingers who are homophobes and transphobes and anti-LGBTQ+. A lot of just moderate Democrats and Republicans are weirded out by this issue, and leftists don't seem to understand this, again, because leftists tend to be so open-minded that they don't have a good understanding that most of mankind is extremely closed-minded, and that's not because they're inherently hateful people and they just hate trans people or hate gay people. It's because they don't understand. They don't understand how it's possible that this can be a legitimate way of living or structuring our culture. And people in general are just very attached to traditions and norms of the past. And these are new issues. Trans people didn't really exist 50 years ago. I mean, you could say they existed, but it's almost as though they didn't exist. This is a new phenomenon in our culture, and you have to come to grips with it. And for a lot of people living in rural parts of the country who are not in elite universities and very progressive university college campuses and so forth, they've never met a trans person. They've never met a gay person. They've never met a bi person. Now, maybe they've met some who were closeted and so forth, but for the most part, you got to understand this stuff has been suppressed for hundreds of years by our culture. So now, by kind of opening everything up and opening Pandora's box, this starts to freak people out. So even though, of course, there's no problem being gay or bi or trans or whatever, the problem that you have to be sensitive to is how this is going to impact culture at large. And if it makes people uncomfortable or fearful or weirded out, this is going to influence their politics. Now, of course, if you're a leftist, you're going to say, well, Leo, but that's their problem. If they're weirded out or creeped out or grossed out by LGBTQ, that's just their bigotry talking. Again, I want to caution you about this sort of justification for your position. It's actually something deeper than just bigotry that's going on here. You can be uncomfortable with these things. That doesn't necessarily make you a bigot. It's just because you haven't really been exposed to it yet, right? Like, think about it this way. There was some time in your life when you didn't know what trans was. You didn't know what homosexuality was. You had to be exposed to it for the first time. And that first time you were exposed to it, it kind of like screwed with your mind a bit. Because, you're just used to like boys and girls, men and women. And now they tell you that there's non-binary genders, third kinds of genders, or you could switch from one gender to another gender. This is it's confusing. It's legitimately confusing. It takes time to wrap your mind around it. Now, if you grew up in that kind of like very progressive leftist culture, that sort of like UC Berkeley culture, then from a young age, you were just exposed to that and it's kind of normal to you. But for older people who were not raised that way, like most of our parents, and in fact, most people around the whole country and around the world, they were not raised with this acceptance of LGBTQ. They didn't even know what this was 10 years ago. This term didn't even exist 10 years ago. Some people, believe it or not, this is as basic as it gets. Some people are just weirded out just by that label, LGBTQ+, because they don't even know what it means. Or they think it's some sort of, hippie construct, hippie social construct that isn't grounded in biology or in practical reality, right? This is how people think. You may think this is backwards, but again, look, if we're building a society and we're trying to evolve our society to greater heights of development, which is what we're talking about here ultimately, you have to be sensitive that we have to bring everyone along in this developmental process. And of course, many of these people are going to be scared and stubborn. It's almost like dragging a stubborn old mule up a mountain. It doesn't want to go. It's resisting. So you have to find ways of enticing this mule to come along and not freaking it out. And leftists, sometimes they make the problem worse because, again, they lack the understanding and the perspective and the compassion necessary to understand that a large percentage of the population is freaked out by these things and they need a more subtle approach, a more subtle introduction. Now, of course, leftists might say, well, Leo, we've tried that approach of subtlety, but these people are such bigots and such transphobes and such homophobes that it doesn't work. They're like aggressively ignorant and stubborn about their resistance to this. They're not open-minded, so it doesn't work. Look, I agree with you. There is a certain percentage of the population who are just literally bigots and racists and sexists and misogynists and homophobes and transphobes, and no amount of gradual approach is going to really work on them. But still, I would say that's the minority. The majority, who really is what we're talking about here when we're talking about developing and evolving our politics and our society, we're not talking about, we can't bring everybody along with us. There's always going to be people who are very underdeveloped, very stubborn, and they're just going to stick to their guns. And the only way we're going to move beyond them is just through the next generation being born and the old generation dying of natural causes. There's always going to be some degree of that. But mostly when we're talking about shaping political opinion and moving Overton windows and so forth, we're talking about the people in the middle. Let's say we have a bell curve. Most people are in the middle. Let's say 60% of people are in the middle of that bell curve. And then we have extremes to both sides. So when shaping public opinion, it's important that we keep our attention focused on that middle 60%, shaping their minds rather than the extreme far right, which you're never going to change. And that's okay. And you don't need to change them, because if you can capture this 60% in the middle and shift them a little bit towards the left, that's enough to evolve society and to win elections and everything, right? You're never winning an election with even 80% of the vote, so that's fine. But when you start going extreme with LGBTQ issues and non-binary genders and gender fluidity and people identifying as animals and other sorts of weird things, like when you start to get into this sort of like magical, highly unpragmatic attitude towards sexuality and gender roles and so forth, with dozens and 50 different pronouns and this sorts of stuff, and then you start to get very attached to those, and then you start demanding people call you by those pronouns, and you start to expect culture to accommodate you, the majority to accommodate these very fringe identifications, you start to lose that middle 60%. because to them it just seems like wacky, it seems impractical, it seems entitled, it seems narcissistic. That we should carve out special categories for you because you've come up with your own personal gender category that you invented with your friends, and you have your own pronouns you invented, and now we have to change all of our language and all of our customs and all the ways we do business to accommodate you. Do you see how that comes off as narcissistic? It comes off as childish. It comes off as immature. That's just how it comes off. Because the reality is this: if you lived in some other part of the world, some third world country where survival was really, really difficult, not in a democracy, not in a wealthy place, not in some stage green suburb or urban area of America or Europe, then this coming up with your own gender pronouns and gender identifications and categories, and even the notion of being gay or trans, these are luxuries that do not exist in those kinds of cultures. Now, of course, you might say, well, Leo, even in those cultures, there's gay people. Yeah, there's gay people and they're still in the closet and so forth. Of course, there's some degree of that. But for the most part, survival in these kinds of cultures is so difficult that these issues don't even rise to the level of being issues for most people in these kinds of cultures. It's only when a culture becomes very wealthy and affluent and you have most of your basic needs taken care of that then you start to play around with pronouns and you start to get all fancy with LGBTQ stuff. Now, this might come off as offensive to those of you who are part of the LGBTQ community. You might say, no, Leo, LGBTQ, this is not a luxury. This is something very core and fundamental to who I am. This is not some sort of luxury. Don't treat it as a luxury. But the reality is, just look at the history. The history of societies is that this stuff is a luxury. These issues have only really come about to the forefront in the last 50 years, precisely because society has evolved to the point where these luxuries can be afforded. If you're living in Saudi Arabia, you don't have this kind of luxury. You have to worry about much more fundamental survival issues. And this is something that leftists and progressives don't really appreciate deeply enough. It is kind of a sense of entitlement, actually, that you have. That you're able to do all sorts of political activism on behalf of LGBTQ. In previous generations of societies, survival was so difficult that you didn't have this kind of privilege. You just had to pick a gender, the one you were born with, go with it, go with the norms, have a family, raise a traditional family, do the traditional stuff. This is how humanity has survived for the majority of human civilization. Now, that's not an excuse. It doesn't mean we have to always be like that forever. But also, you have to, as a leftist, understand that these are new, fairly radical ideas that it's going to take time for them to disseminate throughout culture. And there's going to be resistance to it and fear and discomfort with it. There's also some other problems with LGBTQ. One of the problems is that as you're creating space for these alternative modes of identifying and alternative sexualities, this does encroach and undermine some of the traditional forms of sexuality and masculine-feminine polarity that has been the engine that drove human civilization and family structures for thousands of years. It is the case that in modern times, men and women are not taught very well how to be masculine and how to be feminine. It's almost like these are being neglected for the sake of, they're just being neglected, and sort of the hot button popular issues are LGBTQ issues, when really the majority of mankind identifies as man or woman, masculine or feminine, and that's what they're most comfortable with. So maybe 95% fall into that category. Maybe if you want to be very generous to the LGBTQ folk, you could say 90% fall into the traditional masculine-feminine polarity category. So that's 90% of your population right there. That's what you should be most concerned about. That's not a mistake to be concerned mostly about that. And I would say that in the last 50 years, as a society, as a culture, we've done a bad job of teaching men how to be masculine and teaching women how to be feminine. And there is some truth to the fact that with the rise of feminism, well, feminism has many good qualities to it. Part of the problem with feminism is that the equalization of men and women that has happened in the last 50 years has led to problems with men learning how to be masculine and women how to be feminine. It creates sort of a confusion there, and it creates a sort of a blurring of the lines. Now you might say, well, Leo, these lines were artificial to begin with. They were social constructs. To a certain degree, they were artificial, but to an important degree, they were not merely artificial. There are legitimate and important biological differences between men and women, between their bodies, between how hormones affect them, between their physical strength, between things that men are good at and weak at, and then what women are good at and weak at. It's not that men or women are better, one or the other. It's that there are trade-offs, and there are pros and cons to being a man and to being a woman, or to being masculine, to being feminine. And lately, these trade-offs have been denied in certain parts of progressive circles and leftist circles, have been questioned, and this has created confusion, which contributes to the sort of epidemic we have nowadays of, a lot of men these days struggle to get laid, the whole incel phenomena. A lot of men struggle to find their masculine core. And a lot of women also struggle with femininity as well. And then, women are hurt by this too, because most women are attracted to masculine men. So when there's a shortage of masculine men, then women suffer from this. Then women are not getting the best mates and partners that they could be getting as well. And they're not satisfied either. So while, of course, the traditional masculine-feminine gender roles should not be exclusive, there needs to be room for LGBTQ stuff and for alternatives. In the end, your sexuality, you choose your own sexuality however you want. But also, when we're talking about politics, we're talking about how to construct society for the benefit of the majority of people. The majority of people, when it comes to gender and sexuality, are heterosexual and traditional in this respect. And so not appreciating this creates problems. When you leave men behind and you leave women behind, and they're not able to learn how to be proper men and women in the way that they want, right? It's not that we're forcing them, it's that they want it. The problem is that we're not teaching them how to do it very effectively these days. And so, because in the past there were stronger role models. And today there's more of like leeway. It's like you can be gay, you can be bi, you can be trans, you can be Q, you can be something else. This does create confusion for people. And I don't think that saying that makes you a transphobe or a homophobe. This is, again, one of those areas where leftists go too far in strawmanning and demonizing anybody who is raising any questions on this issue. I want you as a leftist to admit that it is possible to have legitimate opposition and criticisms of the LGBTQ community. Now, granted, there are illegitimate criticisms. There is legitimate bigotry and hatred and just pure ignorance, especially on behalf of many far right-wingers. That does exist. But just because that exists Do not make the mistake of thinking that all criticism and opposition to LGBTQ stuff and all concerns raised about it fall into that category. For example, not all opposition to trans issues is transphobia. I talked about this a little bit in part 1 where we talked about the Joe Rogan example and how Joe Rogan is often labeled as a transphobe by leftists and progressives, when in fact I think that an objective analysis of his position is not that he's a transphobe. He's not afraid of trans people. He doesn't hate trans people. It's that he has certain positions when it comes to trans people in sports. And those are some legitimate issues. You can have legitimate concerns about inequality in sports when it comes to, trans men and women and so forth. And that doesn't negate trans rights. That doesn't negate your right to be trans, or that doesn't mean that it's wrong to be trans. It just means there's nuances here. This is a nuanced issue. There's also, I think, legitimate concerns about how we treat the transitioning of kids and teens as a culture. This is also something that Joe Rogan gets hung up on a lot, and a lot of right-wingers, but not right-wingers, but even a lot of moderates, I think, get hung up on this. When you start talking about taking a 12-year-old kid or a 14-year-old kid or a 16-year-old kid and putting them on puberty blockers, hormones, testosterone, estrogen, or, in the most extreme cases, when you start talking about doing surgery. Now, granted that a lot of right-wingers will over-exaggerate some of the dangers of this. The reality is that surgery, like genital surgery, is not done almost ever on kids that are that young. But even so, even putting somebody that young on hormones or puberty blockers, this can create problems. And it's okay to be concerned about that and to raise concerns about whether that's right or whether that's wrong, or asking questions about, like, at what age is it appropriate? It's also okay to worry about what this will do, to kids, because there's a factor, let's call it social contagion, that I think many leftists don't take seriously enough. By the way, I have an episode called Is Gender a Social Construct?, where I talk about how gender is a social construct in many ways. However, just because gender is a social construct does not mean that you can willy-nilly invent whatever other kind of social construct you want to replace it, and that things will go great. Gender is, in a sense, a social construct. However, it's been a social construct that has also aligned with our biology, and also it has stood the test of time for thousands of years. It's worked. So you should think twice about going in there and screwing around with this kind of stuff and just inventing your own social constructs, right? Just because something is a social construct does not make it good, does not make it healthy, does not mean you're going to be happy with it. There are a lot of toxic social constructs, and then there's also healthy and workable, practical social constructs. So I could start to identify myself as a unicorn. I could do that. And in a certain sense, what's the difference between identifying as a unicorn versus identifying as a Russian? I could identify as a Russian because I'm Russian. They're both social constructs. Being Russian is a social construct. Being an American is a social construct. America itself is a social construct, right? But not all social constructs are created equal. Some are more practical and realistic than others. So while I could identify as a unicorn, it's also kind of silly and frivolous for me to identify myself as a unicorn. Take that into account. Many of the social constructs that we have come to us through a long chain of evolutionary processes and trial and error. And Nobody just sat down and invented them on the couch. They were invented gradually, slowly over hundreds and thousands of years because that's what worked. And so when you start to tinker with that, you might create something awful. And so this is a concern with trans stuff. Now, studies show that for the majority of trans people, when they do hormone blockers and so forth, and they do the transition, that they're happy with the end result. Studies seem to show that. However, the research on this is still pretty young. We don't have a good track record of lots of people transitioning, and there's different ways you can go about it. And so you have to worry about people who do go through the transition process and then end up regretting it later. Some percentage that will happen to. Now, I don't know what that percentage is. Is it 5%, 10%, 20%, 50%? I don't know. Studies seem to show that like over 80% are satisfied, but still, that might leave 10 or 20% that are not satisfied or that regret it, and that is a problem. And it's legitimate to be concerned about that. It's one thing for somebody to transition when they're 30 years old. It's another thing for them to transition when they're 14 years old. At 14 years old, the average 14-year-old is a fucking idiot who is just doing what all their friends are doing. Easily brainwashed with groupthink, with propaganda, with ideology, within their progressive bubble that they're growing up in. And so this is what I was saying by this notion of social contagion. There is some element, you have to admit as a leftist, I want you to admit that there is some element to the LGBTQ phenomenon that is pure groupthink and social contagion. Now, what percentage, I don't know. This would require some serious research that I don't think has really been done yet. So what I'm saying here is that let's say that 80% of all LGBTQ folk who identify that way and are that sexual orientation are that way because that's legitimately what is right for them. It feels good for them. It's appropriate for them. And that's great. There's no problem there. But then what I'm saying is that there's maybe 20%, let's say, who are doing it because they're getting sucked into it because others around them are doing it and because it's considered unique. It makes you feel unique. It gives you a unique sense of worth and identity. It makes you feel special. It makes you feel part of some community. These are all very powerful attractors that influence the human psyche. You might say, well, Leo, but why would anybody go out of their way to join LGBTQ plus when in fact they're not that way and they're just straight or whatever? Why would they do that? Because after all, you know, historically, LGBTQ plus people have been bullied and insulted and hated and even killed and physically abused and raped and all this sorts of awful stuff. Why would anybody choose to do that? But you see, it's much more subtle than that. What you have to understand is that even though all that might be true, first of all, that's rapidly changing. That's rapidly improving. It's not as bad as it used to be. So the stigma around LGBTQ plus has been largely removed these days. And that's precisely part of the problem, because when you remove all the stigma of it, then see, now it's like you're joining this special community that makes you feel unique and gives you a sense of purpose and camaraderie. And maybe a bunch of your friends are part of that community. You want to be part of that community too. At that age, you're not thinking clearly. Most people aren't thinking clearly even at 30 years old, let alone at 14. You know, at 14, your friend gets a piercing or a tattoo. You want a piercing or a tattoo. And you're going to act like you really like that piercing and tattoo after you get it, even though that was wrong for you. It didn't authentically come from you. It came from the groupthink that you were a part of, the cultural bubble, the subculture bubble that you're growing up in. See? So don't be so naive as to think that this is not possible and that this does not exist within LGBTQ+. It does exist. The only question is to what percentage. You might say it's 1% or 10% or 30%. I don't know what it is. But whatever percent it is valid to ask what percent is it. It's valid to do science and research into that because we don't know, and it would be valuable for us to know, because if it's 30%, that's a significant problem. That means 30% are just doing this out of conformity and not true to their authentic selves, and then they're going to regret it later, or it's going to screw up their capacity to be happy or to have a marriage or to have the intimate relationship that they want, or they're going to suffer from depression or other kinds of mental disorders and dysfunctions, simply because their mind becomes very confused about what to do, what's right, what's going to give them acceptance and love. In certain subcultures, a kid or a teen might feel like they're going to get more love if they join LGBTQ+ than if they don't. The human mind loves to feel special. There's also a certain appeal to playing a victim role. So even though you might say, well, but LGBTQ folk, they get victimized more, so who would want to deliberately become a victim? Well, if you think that, you don't understand the trickeries of the human psyche. The human psyche loves to play victim because it makes it feel special and unique, and it gives it all sorts of excuses for not growing up and not maturing and not taking on difficult challenges and responsibilities. So there is a sort of appeal to being a victim. Now, am I saying that the majority of LGBTQ folk are that way because they just like being victims? No, of course not. That's silly. I'm not saying that. So I'm making some nuanced points here, and just be careful, because even the fact that I'm making these points might already, in some circles, cast me as a transphobe or as a homophobe or as a right-winger or as a bigot. But that's obviously not what I'm suggesting here. I'm trying to raise legitimate concerns. Now, we can argue to what degree these concerns are legitimate and how prevalent they are, but asking these questions, you should not attack people or demonize people for asking these questions. These are legitimate questions and issues to be asking. And so we need to allow space for that in our political discourse. And so leftists, the most extreme leftists, go wrong here, and they make this mistake where they demonize anybody who then starts to question this kind of stuff. And the reason they do that is because actually it's threatening to their identities, of course. See? Because when we start asking deep questions about LGBTQ+ folk, their lives are difficult enough as it is. If you're a genuine, honest trans person or gay person, I get it. Your life is more difficult than it is for the average guy or girl. Your life is already difficult. And then when we start asking these philosophical questions about, like, well, are you authentically gay, or is it some sort of social contagion, or are you authentically trans, or did you just do it because your friends were doing it, or whatever? Like, when we start asking these questions, it can come off as insulting to you. It's like, Leo, you're adding insult on top of injury when you do this, when you allow for all this kind of questioning. Because I can never settle into my identity, right? Because these people, they suffer from not having a concrete identity. Their identity is too fluid, and this leads to depression, all sorts of, suicidal thoughts and so forth. Because fundamentally, you don't know who you are. That's confusing. But hey, look, I mean, you've sort of taken that burden on yourself. When you're talking about gender fluidity, and you're opening yourself up to just not being a man or a woman or just being straight, then you're opening yourself up to all sorts of weird variations. And yes, this is going to cause more confusion within you. It's also going to cause more confusion within your community and society and culture. And if you're going to open that can of worms, then that's going to open all sorts of interesting and perhaps threatening philosophical questions and political questions. Like, what do we do about bathrooms? What do we do about sports competitions? What do we do about dressing rooms? What do we do about other things like this? Like, These are questions that now, if we're going to open that can of worms, fine, but then we have to all as a society have a conversation about what we're going to do and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's comfortable, what's uncomfortable, what's weird, what's not weird. And I feel in a certain sense, we have not had this conversation. In a certain sense, these trans issues have kind of been thrust upon the majority of culture and society after they've kind of already been deliberated in elite universities. It's like the folks and academics in universities have sort of like thought through some of this stuff. They've come to their conclusions, and now that they've reached their conclusions, they just want to push all those conclusions onto the rest of society. But the rest of society has not gone through that. It's really a philosophical process of asking, what is a man? What is a woman? These are not obvious questions. And for the majority of people, their notion of what is a man and what is a woman and what is sex, these are just handed down through tradition and through culture. They don't think deeply about these questions. No child has ever deeply wondered, what does it mean to be a boy or a girl? No. And we as a society have really not addressed these issues. Everyone seems to have their own opinion about it, but then there needs to be a dialogue where we come to some kind of consensus. That hasn't really happened. What we've had sort of like culture wars, which is not the same thing as dialogue. So that was all the point of LGBTQ stuff. Let's move on. The next point where leftists go wrong is not appreciating that minorities and immigrants from third world countries are actually fairly conservative. Hispanics and blacks, you might think they're very liberal. Actually, they tend to be fairly conservative. Why is that? Because their cultures tend to be fairly conservative. They tend to be rather religious, traditional cultures. Black culture in the South is pretty conservative and very religious. That's where tradition it comes from. When Spanish-speaking people come up from the South into America to cross the border, whether they're from Mexico or Guatemala or Honduras or wherever, many of these sort of like refugees, people that are fleeing gang violence and drug warlords and gangs and stuff like that, they come from like traditional Catholic cultures. They're not pro-abortion. They're not pro-socialist or Marxist. They don't have very progressive ideas about gender roles. They're not LGBTQ open. They're pretty conservative. This is why, for example, in the 2020 primary Democratic election, Bernie Sanders did not win the presidency, the nomination, the Democratic nomination for presidency. And Joe Biden beat him substantially because for a while it seemed like Bernie Sanders would win because the first few primaries held in the Northeast, in the Boston area, those first few primaries, New Hampshire and so forth, Bernie Sanders does really well over there because it's mostly like very progressive white liberals. But then, Bernie Sanders did really well in Nevada, my state. He did the best in Nevada, actually, because it's sort of a West Coast, very liberal, white liberal state as well. Although we have quite a few minorities here as well. But anyways, but then when it came to the South, when it came to the Carolinas and to all of the South, Joe Biden beat him handily. And many progressives were shocked by this. How is this possible? But this should not be shocking because actually black voters in the South are going to vote for relatively conservative Democrats, not for socialists and Marxists. And this is an oversight that I see many on the left have. And then they even go so far as to blame the DNC or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden for stealing it from Bernie Sanders. No. In 2020, nobody stole it from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders lost simply because there are not that many progressives and far-right leftists in this country. The majority of Democrats are rather moderate and conservative Democrats. And this is not acknowledged by many progressives. They're in denial about this. Progressives want to paint the picture that the majority of the country is progressive. This is absolutely false. We've touched upon this. I've actually explained, I've explained why that's wrong in part one, remember, where I was talking about how progressives misuse opinion polls and policy polls to portray most of the country as progressive. But when you're talking about whether most of the country is progressive or conservative, what you have to take into account is not the policy. It doesn't matter what the policies are. You take a look at their spiral stage of development, and you take a look at their culture and their values. What culture do they subscribe to? The culture issues. That's what really matters. People vote on culture, not on policy. People vote based on spiral stage and vibe, not on policy. So by those metrics, the majority of the country is fairly conservative, either outright right-wing or sort of like centrist Democrat or even conservative Democrat, the sort of Joe Manchin Democrat. Now, progressives love to demonize people like Joe Manchin as if he shouldn't exist and as if all Democrats should just be like AOC. This is preposterous. Completely preposterous. Joe Manchin is in a deeply conservative state. He's in West Virginia, which is a very red state. The fact that we even have a Democrat from a Democratic senator from a red state that can win elections consistently as he has is a godsend, because you could imagine that really the senator from West Virginia should be very conservative Republican, not a Democrat at all. And the idea that a progressive can win in West Virginia is preposterous. This has actually been tried and it failed. It doesn't work. But progressives have fooled themselves into thinking that a progressive can win in West Virginia. The problem isn't that, Joe Manchin is not conservative enough. The problem is that we need someone to replace him who's way more progressive, and then West Virginians will go for that and vote for him. No, that's not going to happen. And this is not just true in West Virginia, but many purple states. In purple states, progressives like AOC cannot win. This is something that progressives are in denial about. And you have to be careful as a progressive assuming that you have the Latino vote or the black vote locked in. That's not the case at all. And in fact, if you look at the polling for Trump, he got a lot of success with Latinos. Why is that? Because a lot of them are coming from very traditional cultures. This is actually a mistake that right-wingers make, is right-wingers tend to assume that, if Hispanics are coming over the border, all these Hispanics are going to vote Democrat. That's actually not true. A lot of these Hispanics are very traditionally minded. They're anti-socialist. They're anti-Marxist. They're anti-LGBTQ, and they're going to vote for conservatives in many cases, as long as you don't offend them by calling them rapists and other sorts of, racist things like that. As long as the right-wing party is not overly racist and bigoted towards Hispanics, Hispanics will gladly vote for conservatives. Which brings us to the next problem with leftists. This is a very huge problem. Perhaps one of the biggest problems that I see is that leftists love to demonize neoliberals and centrists. They love to demonize anybody who's moderate and to cast them as right-wingers. In the progressives' mind, the way they see politics is like there's the progressives who are the good guys, and then there's the radical right-winger MAGA people who are the evil guys, and then there's the people in the middle, like the mainstream news, the CNN and MSNBC anchors, and the never Trumper Republicans and conservatives, and the Joe Manchin types, and all of these, they're just helping the right-wingers. They're just enabling the right-wingers, and that they are really as bad as the right-wingers are. This creates a sort of a polarization where in the progressive's mind, either you're a progressive or you're a bad guy because you're enabling bad guys. This is way overly simplistic, and it's not the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that the majority of the population is moderate. And progressivism, this is a fringe movement. Now, there are a lot of good ideas within progressivism, but you have to understand that it's going to take time. It's going to take decades for those ideas to diffuse themselves into the larger culture. And that's going to take a culture war that you're going to have to fight. And that moderates are not the bad guys. Moderates are actually the people who prevent society from breaking out into a total culture war and even a civil war. What prevents that is moderates. And the trick that extremists on both sides play, both the right extremists and the left extremists, is that when you're an extremist, part of what it means to be an extremist is that you believe that anyone who's a moderate is an enemy. This is what makes your extremism extra extreme. You're not just an extremist, then you say, well, yeah, then there's the moderates, and we can make peace with the moderates and live happily ever after. It's like, no, the extremist believes that the moderates are actually being extreme in their moderation, and that therefore they're even more dangerous than the extremists. That's how an extremist thinks, whether on the left or the right. This is a problem, because the thing that keeps society stable is the moderates in the middle, the 60% of moderates. And if all we had were just the extremist progressives, society would spiral out of control. This is something that leftists don't like to admit to themselves because they feel so justified in their extremism. Now look, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that everything needs to be split down the middle and that we need to have moderation for the sake of moderation. I'm not saying that. That's a mistake. So it is not the case that when a right-winger argues against climate change and a progressive argues for climate change, that we just need to take that and cut that issue down the middle and just do the moderate middle road solution. No, that's not what I'm saying. That would be a mistake. Nevertheless, there is wisdom in moderation. This wisdom is lost on many leftists. I want you to acknowledge that if you're a leftist. A lot of leftists levy strong criticism against the moderates and centrists. In fact, even stronger criticisms than they do against the right, which is rather perverse. Some progressives love to criticize centrists more than they do MAGA. This is very problematic because it then prevents our political discourse from being calm and civil. It's like it riles everybody up. It polarizes everything, you see. And in this polarized environment, you cannot build a consensus and you actually cannot pass legislation and govern anything. The problem with extremists on both sides is that they refuse to compromise. And they refuse to understand the importance of compromise in forming any kind of government. You're never going to get everything you want when running a government that is governing 300 million people. You're never going to get everything you want. It's never going to be ideal. It's never going to be progressive enough for you. It's never going to be compassionate enough for you. It's never going to be conscious enough for you. You're always going to have to compromise with traditionally minded people, Yes, even with racists and bigots, you're going to have to compromise with them. You're going to have to compromise with homophobes and transphobes. You're going to have to compromise with people who live in rural areas. You're going to have to compromise with poor people and with rich people. That's the challenge of government. And extremists get into their mind that compromise is bad because compromise is selling out to the devil, to the enemy. Why should we compromise with terrorists and evil people? And progressives, of course, tend to demonize the extreme right wing to the point where they see them as evil. Of course, the right wing does the same thing to the far left. But in this situation, you can't get anything done because both sides have demonized each other. Both sides think they're evil. And really, the only ones at that point who can get stuff done are the moderates. But the extremists now demonize the moderates such that the moderates can't even get anything done, right? So the role that extremists play is that they polarize the rest of the moderates towards their side. That's what they're trying to do. The extreme right wing is trying to pull people from the moderate 60% into their camp. And the extreme left wing is trying to do the same thing. And the more that happens, there's left of the moderates, the more extremists you have on both sides, and then you create a civil war in the worst case scenario. That's what's been happening over the last 10 years. Now, the leftists will say, well, Leo, but the right-wingers are worse at this. You're making it sound like we're both extremists in the same way, but actually the right-wingers are more extreme, and their extremism is more dangerous than our extremism. That's a debatable point as to, which extremism is more dangerous. Now, personally, I think that right-wing extremism is more dangerous than left-wing extremism. But still, that doesn't mean that you're completely innocent. And that doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility for the polarization that is happening. See, because the leftist extremists justify their extremism to themselves by saying that, well, but the right wing has been going completely crazy in the last 10 years. They've just become way, way, way extreme. They've been trying to shift the Overton window to the right now, and they've been successful at it. So we need to counterbalance that and compensate by becoming even more extreme in our leftism in order to shift the Overton window to the left. And it turns into this tug of war. What I want to suggest to you is that there's a mistake that's going on here. You can see this situation from a higher elevation perspective. And here is really something that is sneaky that leftists do, a very sneaky mistake that I want to call out, which is that since leftists love to demonize moderates and centrists, as soon as somebody comes along that tries to communicate to a leftist their blind spots and the problems with their radicalism and extremism and tries to show them a tier 2, a spiral dynamics tier 2 way of looking at politics. Something like conscious politics or stage yellow politics. They start to hear that and they say, okay, I know what this is. This is just another centrist or another moderate talking to me. Leo is just a moderate. He's just like the guys on CNN. He just wants to take both sides and split it down the middle. That's all that Leo's trying to do with these episodes. So there's nothing new here. You're wrong. I am not communicating with you as a centrist does on CNN. It might seem that way to you because I'm calling you out for being too extreme. So in your mind, as a leftist, you'll say, well, if he's calling me out for being too extreme, that means the only alternative is that I have to become a centrist and a moderate, like on CNN. And I don't like that. Therefore, Leo is just trying to turn me into a centrist like him. No. I'd like you to open your mind to a third possibility. There is a possibility that very few people in politics have actualized, which is being able to see politics from a tier 2 spiral dynamic stage yellow perspective. I don't have time to elaborate upon what that means exactly. Go watch my spiral dynamic stage yellow episode for more on that. Also, go watch my 4-part series called Conscious Politics, part 1, 2, 3, 4, where I explain that kind of perspective. But if you watch that series on conscious politics, you'll see that what I call conscious politics is not centrism. It does not mean you have to be a moderate Democrat. It does not mean you have to give up your most important progressive ideals. And it is not the kind of stuff that's happening on CNN. It's a totally new way of looking at politics. I call it conscious politics. It's a non-ideological, non-partisan way of looking at politics, but it's also not just your standard CNN type of centrism, which is afraid to call out the extreme right. I have no problem calling out the far right for its stupidities and its dangers. And I've done that in the past. So clearly, I'm not just trying to be moderate here. I've used actually very extreme language in criticizing the MAGA movement and conservatives and so forth. But what I want you to see is that you can reach such a high level of cognitive, moral, and spiritual development, the development of your psyche, that you literally transcend this notion of right versus left versus center. This whole spectrum with all the Overton windows and all this, the entire gamut of political discourse that happens on YouTube and throughout mainstream and non-mainstream media, which includes the far right, which includes the moderate right, which includes the moderate left, and includes the far left, that this whole spectrum, there's something beyond all that. You can go meta to all of that. I think the problem, though, is that when I try to introduce this idea to many progressives and far leftists, they dismiss the idea by saying, oh, well, Leo is saying that, but actually what he's really trying to trick me into doing is just becoming a moderate and a centrist. And I don't like that. But that's not what I'm suggesting you do. I'm suggesting a totally new way of looking at politics and government. A much more intelligent, more nuanced, more complex way, a much less biased way of going about it. But that would require that you recognize that progressivism, your far left politics, is actually groupthink and ideology. You're not immune to ideology. Ideology exists on the right. It also exists on the left. Now, it's worse on the right, but it's still pretty bad on the left. So you're not immune to that. Really, the enemy here is not the right. Our enemy here is unconsciousness. Our enemy here is lack of development, and our enemy here is ideology. If it's ideology, it's going to create problems, whether it's right ideology or left ideology. So make sure that you don't dismiss what I'm saying here as just more neoliberalism or what's called triangulation or third way politics. So you might say, oh, well, Leo, you're just talking about third way politics and triangulation from the Clinton era. No, that's not what I'm talking about. You might say, I'm talking about a fourth way. If Clinton's politics were third way, then there's a fourth way. Just open your mind to a completely different political paradigm that's neither left nor right, nor centrist. Something totally new. So anyways, I think that leftists err when they over-demonize mainstream media like CNN and MSNBC. I see a lot of this on progressive YouTube. Progressive YouTubers love to shit on CNN and MSNBC. They think they're being intelligent and wise when they do this. They're actually not. They're being foolish. Now, does this mean that I endorse all of CNN and MSNBC? No, of course not. There's problems with CNN and MSNBC, but progressives tend to not understand what the problems are and where the problems come from. The problems with CNN and MSNBC come from simply the fact that these channels have to appeal to the widest possible audiences and to the lowest possible common denominator, which means that they can't take strong progressive positions, not because they're corrupt or whatever else. It's simply because their whole business model and their project is to present news to the majority of Americans. That's their business model. And when you're doing that, you can't come off as extremely progressive because you're going to alienate half the country. Now, you might, as a progressive, you might say, well, that's wrong. But then again, if CNN and MSNBC did become very progressive as you want them to be, who would deliver just factual news? Who's going to do that? See, the problem with progressives is that progressives want CNN and MSNBC to be very activist. They don't want them to just report factual news. They want CNN and MSNBC to actually take positions, progressive positions. Now, I totally understand why you want CNN and MSNBC to take strong progressive positions, but that's not the business they're in. They're in the business of delivering factual news. They're in the business of reporting. You know, if a bomb blows up, they're in the business of reporting that. If a war starts, they're in the business of reporting that in an objective way. Now, you might say, well, but they're not objective. Well, look, no one is ever objective. Do you think the progressives are objective? Progressives are not objective. In fact, alternative media is less objective than mainstream media. Just because mainstream media does not cater to your biases does not mean that they're less objective. When it comes to factual reporting, CNN and MSNBC are about as objective as you can get. Do they make mistakes sometimes? Sure. Do they have biases? Of course. There are capitalistic biases. There are biases of the stage of development that CNN administrators, managers, and hosts are at. The majority of people working at CNN and MSNBC are spiralodynamic stage orange/green. That's going to be their bias because that's their worldview. You can't avoid that. Your bias will always be the stage of development that you're at because you don't know any better. They don't know any better. Also, they're running, multi-billion-dollar businesses. So they're influenced by Wall Street. They're influenced by considerations of their stock price. They're influenced by advertisers, of course. But you know what? Your mainstream, your alternative sort of stream, YouTube progressive pundits and commentators are also, they're not objective. They're also biased. They're also influenced by advertising and sponsorships and other things like that. So be careful when the pot is calling the kettle black. You have to be extremely careful when you're calling somebody out for being biased within politics, because the majority of the time when that is happening, actually, you're just projecting your own bias onto them. What you really mean when you say somebody is biased in politics is you mean they don't have my biases. That's what you're criticizing them for. You don't really care if they're objective or not. As a progressive, you don't care about objectivity. What you care about is progressive bias. That's what you care about. There's also demonization of people like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, and others of this ilk who get demonized by progressives as being far right-wingers, when in fact they're not. They're actually pretty moderate. Some of their positions can be a bit wacky. Some of their positions can be right-wing. But for the most part, if you think Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Joe Rogan, and like Brett Weinstein and others like this, these intellectual dark web people, that they are far right-wing, or even fascists, or Islamophobes, or homophobes, you're not understanding these people. These are sophisticated thinkers. They're pretty open-minded. They can hold a pretty decent intellectual conversation. They're generally intellectually honest people. Now, do they have positions that I personally disagree with? Of course. There are many positions that Jordan Peterson holds that I find silly and absurd and even abhorrent. But as far as the right wing goes, Jordan Peterson is actually one of the right wingers who is most intellectually honest. You can actually have an intellectually honest conversation with him. That doesn't mean he's going to agree with you or you're going to agree with him, but he's one of the more decent conservatives, even though there's a lot of stuff with him that I disagree on. Likewise with Sam Harris. Sam Harris is even better than Jordan Peterson. He's very reasonable. He's very open-minded. You can have some really good conversations with Sam Harris. Now, does he have some silly ideas? Of course he does. Almost everybody in this field has some silly ideas. Same with Joe Rogan. Lately, Joe Rogan has been going more right-wing, and there's a lot of stuff he says that I disagree with, but for the most part, you can have a decent intellectual conversation with Joe Rogan. He's going to be pretty open-minded. You can present arguments to him, and he's going to listen to you. That's what we ultimately want from our political discussions, is just people we can have honest dialogue with, who do not resort to name-calling and smearing you and character assassinating you and just being rabidly ideological. I don't consider any of these people to be rabidly ideological. Now, is their mind infected with certain ideologies? Yes, of course, as pretty much as everybody else in this field. But these are not these sort of like moronic MAGA people that you can't have a reasonable conversation with, right? These people are willing to look at evidence. These people are willing to look at research. They're willing to change their mind. And that's good stuff. So don't demonize these people. There's a whole cottage industry of progressive YouTube where all they do is they just shit on Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, and others like that. I think that this is where the left and progressives are the weakest when they do this. First of all, they don't accurately represent the true positions of people like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Joe Rogan. They present straw man positions. And this does a disservice to the left. It makes the left intellectually dishonest and stupid. You want to be open to genuinely considering the perspectives of people like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, and others, if you want to really evolve beyond stage green, which is what we're trying to do here. And a lot of the characteristics that these people exhibit, such as Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, they do exhibit a lot of stage yellow qualities. They're not strict partisans. Does that mean they're solid stage yellow? Of course not. They have a lot of regressive elements and shadow elements that keep them stuck in stage orange, stage blue. But they're showing signs of yellow. And you should take notice of that. And don't demonize them for that. See, the key mistake that stage green makes is it demonizes stage yellow, because stage yellow can remind stage green too much of stage orange. I've talked about that in my Spiral Dynamics series. Go check that out. Another mistake that leftists make is not acknowledging that many Republicans and conservatives are actually moderate and reasonable. I've noticed this trend especially in the last 4 years. Progressives act as though all Republicans have lost their minds, as though all Republicans are MAGA Republicans. This is not true. There are plenty of good, decent, reasonable, moderate Republicans. A lot of them are found on CNN and MSNBC. I'm talking about people like David Frum, Joe Scarborough, Joe Walsh, Liz Cheney. Now, these are conservative people, and a lot of their positions and policies I disagree with. However, I am able to distinguish between them, these so-called never-Trumpers, like these are actually the true conservatives, versus the MAGA people. The MAGA people are completely shameless. They have no integrity. They have no interest in facts or reason or truth. Whereas these moderate Republicans and conservatives, they do. They do have integrity. And I give them a lot of credit for that, because it's not easy to have that kind of integrity when the majority of your party has lost its mind and gone down the road of MAGA and other sorts of conspiracy theories and far-right extremism and fascism and racism and so forth. These people didn't do that. And they don't get enough credit for it from progressives. In fact, progressives love to demonize these people by saying that, well, Leo, it seems like they're very different from the right-wing MAGA people, but actually, if we elected a more moderate Republican president, like let's say somebody who's not as crazy as Donald Trump, let's say we elect a Ron DeSantis type or a Marco Rubio or something like that, we elect one of these people who's a bit more moderate, it's like they would still pass all the same policies as Trump. Therefore, they're as bad as Trump. Like, if Liz Cheney was president, Liz Cheney, even though she opposes MAGA and Trump, and she wants to see him like impeached and stuff like that and kicked out of office, if Liz Cheney was president, she voted 90% of her voting record is identical to Trump's. So she supports most of Trump's policies. Therefore, what's the difference between Trump and Liz Cheney? It's just a matter of like surface level, decorum. And so progressives will criticize these moderate Republicans as just kind of like putting on the decorum of being kind of like nice and not as vile as Donald Trump. But the reality is that their policies are as bad as Trump's. Now, there's some truth to that. However, you're not appreciating the importance of what you dismiss as decorum. It's not merely decorum. It's a lot more than just decorum. It's integrity. It's character. It's truth. It's honesty. It's factuality. It's being aware of one's own biases and calling them out. It's being able to call out your side when it goes too extreme. That's not merely decorum. That's extremely necessary to have healthy politics. Now, progressives will say, well, Leo, even if there are a few of these people who are supposedly the good Republicans, there's so few of them that it's pointless to even talk about them because there's like 1% of them and the other 99% are MAGA. No, you're wrong. There's actually a lot more of these moderate conservative Republicans, these decent Republicans with integrity. The key there is integrity. You want a conservative with integrity. I can respect a conservative with integrity. What I can't respect is a conservative without integrity, which is what MAGA has become. But there are far more than just 1 or 2 or even 5 or 10% of conservatives with integrity. There are a lot more. And I think one of the biggest not talked about failures in media that has happened over the last 5 or 6 years since Trump came to power is the underemphasis of how many conservatives and Republicans there are who are moderate and reasonable. It's just that they don't get the same press. You see, when Trump is out there saying ridiculous, obnoxious things, and so are his followers, that sucks up all the oxygen in the room. All the attention goes on the crazies. This creates a sort of a reality distortion field where you start to think that the entire Republican Party has lost its fucking mind. That's actually not true. A lot of decent, moderate Republicans are voting for Trump, not because they like Trump, not because they don't see the problems with Trump. It's because they're just too afraid of extremist leftism. They're too afraid of Marxism and weird trans issues that creep them out. They're too afraid with that stuff. And they're also just fiscally conservative. They want tax cuts and so forth, that they just vote Republican. Now you might say, well, Leo, if they do that, then they have no integrity. Not quite. It's a relative matter. If you see, because what happens is that you have to understand is that especially in the last 5 years, the stuff that comes into mainstream consciousness and makes the news is all the most radical, sensationalist, dramatic stuff. It's the terrorism activity, it's the bomb explosions, all that, but it's also the most extreme and wacky, crazy right-wing ideas, and it's also the most extreme, crazy, wacky left-wing ideas. Both get caricaturized and demonized and turned into straw man, right? So on the right, it's this idea of fascism and so forth. That gets turned up to 11 as the ultimate threat. And on the left, what becomes the threat is this sort of like harebrained Marxist revolution stuff. It's like, we're going to ditch capitalism and just go pure Marxism. Many moderates, when they hear a demonized version of leftism, what they see is Soviet communism, Soviet Marxism. And of course, they don't want that, so they vote for someone like Trump. The right-wing ecosystem like Fox News, OAN, and Alex Jones and other alternative right-wing news, they have done such a good job at demonizing the far left that it has scared the bejesus out of many in the center. And there are so many in the center who are just quiet, who don't create a lot of drama, who aren't very passionate, and who are not willing to slit anyone's throat over their political ideas. And because of that, they don't make the news. And because of that, you don't hear their voices. And because of that, all you hear are the loudest voices on the far right and the loudest voices on the far left. And then you get a distorted picture of our political situation. I think that despite all the polarization that we've had over the last 5 years in our politics, the majority of Americans are still relatively moderate and reasonable, and they are not as polarized as we think when we look at the news. The news accentuates the drama because that's what creates clicks and views. And that's not just done by CNN and MSNBC, that's also done by the most progressive of progressives, and of course by the far right. So all sides are responsible for this. It's a huge problem. It creates this very distorted picture of what's really going on in our politics. So yes, there are good, decent, integrous, moderate Republicans and conservatives. And in fact, we need to emphasize this a lot more. Because if we don't, that leaves no space for sane conservatives. If you're a leftist and a progressive, understand this, that when you demonize moderate Republicans and you say that, oh, there are none of them and that none of them will ever be in power again and that all of them have been taken over by MAGA, you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do you see that? You're leaving conservatives no other choice but to go MAGA because you're not going to convert a conservative to become a progressive. Conservatism is a deep structure of the psyche. You don't just change that with a few debates here or there or a few good arguments or a few, policy proposals. A conservative is going to be conservative for life. Half the country is conservative. You're not going to get rid of conservatives anytime soon. They're not going away. So the question isn't whether we have conservatives or not. The question is, do we have a healthy form of conservatism or an unhealthy, toxic form? Trump represents a toxic form. If we want a healthy democracy, that's not going to happen by turning everyone progressive. It's not going to happen. You're in fantasy land. To have a healthy democracy, what we need is we need a robust and healthy conservative wing of American politics. That's the reality. You don't like that? I might not like that either, but that's the reality. And if you say no to that, the only other alternative is not that, oh, all of a sudden we're going to get a bunch of progressives. No. The other alternative is you're going to get a bunch of fucking fascists and MAGA people. That's the alternative. So which would you rather have? Would you rather have more Joe Scarboroughs or would you rather have more Alex Joneses? That's the real choice. Because you ain't going to get Joe Scarborough to become some bleeding heart progressive Marxist. That's not going to happen ever. And you know what? Look at Joe Scarborough. Joe Scarborough is a really interesting example. First of all, he has decent amount of integrity. He started criticizing Trump very early on into Trump's presidency. He broke ranks with him. He did a really good job about that. I respect him for that. But also, if you just take a look at the kind of common sense arguments that he makes. Now, is he the most progressive? Of course not. But he makes some very common sense arguments that I think that the majority of the country would agree with. That's the reality, that you leftists and progressives are fooling yourself over. You're in denial about this. You have to come to accept that society will not evolve as fast as you want it to evolve. It's not going to happen. You have your progressive ideals. I totally understand that. I have those ideals as well. The difference between me and you is that I understand the realities of human development a little bit better. And I understand that just because I'm going to go out there and scream at the top of my lungs my ideals, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. That's not how we're going to build the next stage of society. So I want you to admit to yourself that there's plenty of reasonable conservatives. And if you think there aren't, that's how you know you're fooling yourself. You're stuck in an echo chamber. You're also being fooled by some of the drama that necessarily is accentuated on mainstream media, alternative media, and social media. I also noticed that there's a failure to praise moderates and healthy conservatives when they stand up against extremists. The best example of this is Liz Cheney. Personally, I give huge props to Liz Cheney for standing up against Donald Trump. Extremely difficult. She sacrificed her whole political career basically for this. A lot of progressives, however, love to demonize Liz Cheney because they just hate Dick Cheney so much. They're so biased on that front. And also because they point out that, she has a very conservative voting record in the Senate or in the Congress. And, because of this, she doesn't deserve any praise. No, you have to be able to praise your opponents when they act with integrity. That's the key. Integrity is hugely important. As soon as we sacrifice integrity to achieve our political ambitions, that's when politics goes toxic and wrong. So I give huge credit to any conservative in the last 5 years who has stood up and denounced MAGA. People like Liz Cheney, David Frum, Joe Scarborough, Joe Walsh, and others. And there's plenty of others. What you have to be very careful against is this idea that there is no such thing as a good conservative. Any conservative is a bad conservative. This is a very toxic and dangerous idea. It's also not true. I mean, of course, the right wing is even more guilty of this. The way that the right wing demonizes the left and progressives is completely unethical, completely out of integrity, completely dishonest, and it's created a huge mess out of our whole political system. Let's move on to another point. Another point where leftists go wrong is they tend to want to use government too much to coddle and safety-proof survival. It's almost like progressives want to create a society where you can't harm yourself by making bad decisions. No matter what kind of decision you make, if you make bad decisions, government will come and save you because you're going to get free healthcare, free education, free money, free welfare, free Social Security, free disability if you get disabled, free anything. You shoot up heroin, you're going to get a free therapy, free rehab. If you hit your head, you're going to get free workers' comp or free insurance. If you smoke your whole life, you're going to get free, free cancer treatment, this kind of stuff. And you might say, well, Leo, yeah, isn't that right? That sounds like a very humane society. Yes, in a certain sense, that's good. Some degree of that is nice. We need a certain social safety net that prevents you from suffering the consequences of the most catastrophic consequences of your worst decisions. And just bad luck. You know, sometimes you just get bad luck. We need that. But also be careful what you wish for. Because when government does too much for you, and its safety proofs everything for you, people start to get soft. People stop taking responsibility. People stop treating life and survival seriously the way that they should. Life and survival is a serious game. It's a very serious game with the most serious of consequences. And really, children and young adults need to be raised in an environment where this is a reality for them. Otherwise, they get too spoiled and life becomes too easy. And in a sense, we have been suffering from that in the last 50 years. Now, as a progressive, you might say, well, Leo, life isn't too easy. It's harder than ever to survive. You know, like the baby boomers had it easy. Now the millennials and the Zoomers, it's harder than ever to buy a house. It's harder than ever to afford stuff. It's harder than ever to go to college because of the student loans and the burden that presents. It's harder than ever to afford healthcare and so forth. There is some truth to that. In a certain sense, it's harder. But in another sense, life today is easier than it's ever been in human history, especially in America. And I think we're suffering from the spoilage that comes from that. Today's kids are extremely spoiled. The things they whine about and complain about, our ancestors would be embarrassed that their grandchildren have been so spoiled by us. With all of the video games and social media and Twitter and Facebook and pornography and the cheap food that we have and, you know, the junk food, easy access to travel. You can travel around the world on the cheap these days. Instant, cheap, free communication all around the world. You can literally Skype somebody in Africa from America for free. We start to take all these things for granted. You know, clothing is cheaper than ever. If we're not talking about some sort of expensive, branded, ridiculous clothing, you know, basic clothing is as cheap as ever. Basic food is as cheap as ever. The basics of survival are as easy to procure as ever. Technology is as cheap as ever. It's easier than ever to become complacent with life and to just smoke weed, sit on the couch, watch your Netflix for $10 a month. You know, it's hilarious to me that every couple of years, Netflix, you know, raises their prices for their monthly subscription. And then people start whining and bitching and complaining about it. They almost start to boycott Netflix. Why? Because Netflix raises their monthly price from $12 a month to $15 a month. And people are freaking out over this. This is the level of spoilage. This is the perfect example of spoilage that I'm talking about. You know, you're so ungrateful that you're complaining and bitching and moaning that you have to pay $15 a month to get access to like hundreds of thousands of pieces of content, amazing content, movies, shows, documentaries, educational stuff that you can find on Netflix. You know, your parents' generation were satisfied with just 3 TV channels. 3 TV channels. And now you're pissed off that you have to pay an extra $3 a month to get access to Netflix. This is preposterous. And this kind of thing is going on all around society. In a certain sense, it is true what conservatives say is that, you know, a successful, decadent society makes people weak. That's very true. It does lead to spoilage. And we are experiencing that right now. And while that's true, at the same time, there are problems with late-stage capitalism that has made survival extra challenging for Zoomers and millennials when it comes to owning a house, when it comes to getting healthcare, when it comes to going to college, That's all still true as well. Both are true at the same time. So be careful what you wish for. When you wish for this kind of socialist utopia where life is so easy and everything is taken care of for you, you think this is going to make for better human beings. But actually, it might make for something like idiocracy. The human psyche needs serious challenge and suffering to grow, develop, and mature. When you take away the challenges and the need for growth, people will stop growing. That's not guaranteed. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that without external pressure and challenge that it's impossible to grow. It is possible to get yourself to grow. But when we're talking about a large collective level with hundreds of millions of people, generally the trend is going to be when you take away all the challenges of life, people are just going to turn into pot smoking, Netflix watching, pizza eating, mouth breathing morons. That's what's been happening over the last 50 years in our society. People are going to be sitting around and bitching and whining about a $3 hike increase for Netflix. They're going to be bitching and moaning about that on Twitter all day. That's what they're going to be doing rather than actually going to work, doing something productive, doing something healthy, building a family, building a business, going to school and actually learning something difficult. The thing that has become of our education system is just training spoiled fucking brats these days. Nobody is going and getting a proper education anymore. And then on top of that, they're getting out of that. They're spoiled fucking brats, and they're also $100,000 in debt on top of that. It's the worst of both worlds. One of the things that I respect the most about conservatism is that the conservative worldview is all about, in a sense, at its best, at its healthiest. It's about reminding us of the old school values that generate success. Values like hard work, integrity, family, sacrifice for your community, being disciplined, not being frivolous, being conservative with how you spend your money, saving your money, being intelligent and wise about your investments, not wasting your time on stupid social distractions like social media and celebrity gossip and porn and all this kind of stuff, not getting addicted to weed and other kinds of drugs. This is conservatism at its best. Now, what we see of conservatism today on the news with MAGA and so forth has no resemblance to this. That's because it's been perverted. Conservatism has been perverted. More than ever, what we need are old school conservatives who embody these healthy old school stage blue, spiral dynamic stage blue conservative values, because that serves an important function in society. Without that, society becomes spoiled and soft. People become these stage green, utopian, idealistic, pot-smoking hippies who talk a lot about love and equality and diversity. But in reality, these people cannot run a business, cannot sustain a family, are not disciplined enough to do the difficult shit that's necessary to build a healthy civilization. I'll have a whole episode in the future where I just talk about these conservative values some more. It really is worth repeating and going into some length, but it's a bit of a tangent for this episode. So moving on to the next point. Leftism goes wrong with what's happening on university campuses these days. The activism and identity politics found on most universities and the extreme groupthink that comes along with that is very problematic. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the kind of criticisms that Jordan Peterson has of university culture are completely correct. But if you don't think there's a kernel of truth to the things he's calling out, you're fooling yourself. There is an important kernel of truth there. Now, is he exaggerating it? Yes. Is he fear-mongering about it? Yes. But there is some concerning developments at universities, which is really just stage green groupthink running amok. Remember, spiral dynamic stage green is a fairly collectivist-oriented stage. Stage orange is more individualistic, green is collectivist, yellow is individualistic. Remember that pendulum swings back and forth. So one of the problems with every collectivist spiral stage, whether it's green or blue or purple, is the extreme groupthink that can happen and spiral out of control. So with stage blue, the extreme groupthink is religious fundamentalism. With stage green, the extreme groupthink is the kind of stuff we see on university campuses. This, going over the top with talking about racism and LGBTQ issues, identity politics. Really, our universities are getting spoiled by this political activism. Now, political activism is important. However, here's the problem, is that people between the ages of 18 and, let's say, 23, which are mostly university kids, these people are very immature. They know almost nothing about how reality works, how psychology works, how politics works. They know almost nothing. They're basically morons. And yet, these people go into university and they become very politically active. This is putting the cart before the horse, and Jordan Peterson is right about this. It's not that you can't do both at the same time. You can. You can develop yourself and build your own career, and also you can do political activity. It's fine. You don't need to perfectly put your house in order to do political activity. However, there is truth in that if you can't even pay your own fucking rent, what business do you have being politically active? Don't put the cart before the horse. When you go to university, your primary objective should be to study your ass off and to get a really good education. Get your money's worth and set yourself up for the rest of your life in terms of your career, in terms of your relationships, in terms of your personal development, in terms of your health, in terms of your finances. Get all the basics of survival handled. That's really what university should be about. Don't worry so much about racism and LGBTQ issues and socialism. This is a distraction from getting that handled. Fix yourself first before you fix the world. Why is that important? Because nobody can fix you but you. There are other people who are in a position to fix the world. People who are wealthy, people who have already established themselves, people who are healthy. If you don't have those things in place, who are you to fix the world? Now, I understand that it's tempting to want to go out there and fix the world when you haven't fixed yourself yet. But that does become a trap, don't you see? Because there are plenty of people who can fix the world for you, but there's nobody who can fix you for you. So in practice, what ends up happening is that these young university kids, they talk a big game about utopia and anti-racism and LGBTQ and Marxism, but in reality, these people can't pay their rent. They can't afford to buy a house. They can't pay off their student loans. They don't have health care. And they just work as a barista at Starbucks. How is that going to create a great society? It won't. Really, your first 10 years of adulthood, basically from age 18 to, let's say, 30, like 12 years that is, all of that should be focused on developing yourself, first and foremost. Get your shit together. Don't worry about politics. That's going to become a huge waste of energy. The problem is that when you're doing your politics turns into such a giant waste of mental energy. For the most part, your political activity is doing nothing. It turns into culture wars, arguments, debates, hate-watching people, twittering, this kind of shit. It doesn't actually change anything about government. It doesn't construct anything good. You know, yelling at somebody that they're a homophobe or a racist on Twitter doesn't really accomplish anything. You could put that energy and time towards developing a business or a career or something more productive. And then, think about this, then once you do develop a business or a career, something productive, then you're actually going to have power and money to make meaningful political change. You're also going to be much more intelligent about how you use your time and money because you're going to value your time and money more than you do as a kid without any of it. You'll be able to be much more smart and strategic about how you go influencing politics. You know, sitting around in your college dorm with your roommates, smoking weed, eating pizza, and talking about Marxism, this does not improve society. You see, this is a waste of time. This is foolishness. And all the political activity that's going on at some of these universities, this is creating a distraction. It's distracting students from sitting down and just sticking their face into their textbooks. That's what students should be doing at university. Your face should be so glued to your calculus textbook and your physics textbook and your biology and psychology textbooks that you don't have time to listen to the latest theories about Marxism or who's identifying as a man or a woman or as a unicorn or as a whatever the fuck. You shouldn't give a fuck. You're too focused learning calculus. The fact that you even have time to care about who is identifying as what gender or race or whatever the fuck already tells you how privileged and spoiled you are. Because if you grew up in China, they would be fucking beating you with a ruler to learn calculus. You wouldn't have time to worry about LGBTQ shit in China. It's more old school over there. And that's why they're kicking our ass right now in terms of education. Pumping out engineers, programmers, you know, serious people. And in general, when you're going to university, pick a fucking serious major. Pick a major that actually matters, that's going to make a difference to the world. We don't need 10 million people doing gender studies bullshit. Which is not to say you can't have some gender studies. Fine, you can have some of it. But people are going overboard with this stuff. Pick practical majors. You're getting way too spoiled and too entitled. Another problem with leftists is, in general, they don't appreciate the importance of hierarchies. Stage Green wants to level all hierarchies, and they think that this will be sustainable and it'll work. Sometimes it can work, but a lot of times it can't work. There's reasons that there's a lot of hierarchies in society. It's because that's how shit gets done. In the military, there's a hierarchy. Why? You can't have a military that's a democracy. If we had that, your country would be dead. This logic applies to many other areas of life besides just military. It also applies to corporations, businesses, basically all kinds of organizations, government itself, and so on. So, demonizing hierarchies is a problem. You should not do it. You should see the value that hierarchies have. But of course, we are recognizing that some hierarchies are toxic and corrupt and need to be reformed and changed. And sometimes it's good to level a hierarchy. But before you go leveling a hierarchy, first understand why it's there in the first place. The problem with stage green, it tends to want to level hierarchies without understanding their utility and why they exist there in the first place. So you end up shooting yourself in the foot. There's a criticism that hierarchies are not merit-based. This is an interesting point. I would say this on this matter, is that for the most part in America, most of the hierarchies we have are actually merit-based. Like the military, for example. I would say the majority of the military hierarchy is merit-based. However, not 100% of it. So you can criticize those parts of the hierarchy that are not merit-based, and we should change that, because ideally we want to work towards a hierarchy, if one exists at all, where it is 100% merit-based. That's obviously not the case, but progressives and liberals and leftists sometimes go overboard with this in their criticism of hierarchies, and they basically portray it out to be as meritocracy is a complete myth, it doesn't exist at all, and that all hierarchies are just systems of oppression and corruption and capitalism and special privilege, and it's not a meritocracy at all. That's not true. The next point is that leftists tend to go overboard with calling everything and holding everything as relative and socially constructed. This is part of the postmodernist legacy. Postmodernism, as opposed to modernism, postmodernism was all about recognizing the relativity and the socially constructed nature of many of the things that modernism considered to be just natural truths. So it's true that a lot of stuff that we think of as natural truths is socially constructed. For example, science is a social construction. Scientific truths are relative truths. This is true. However, you have to be very careful about this because progressives can then go too far with this. And they can say, well, Leo, if science is a social construction, and Leo, you have a whole episode that says that science is a myth, deconstructing the myth of science. If you watch that series of mine, you can say, well, Leo, my God, so science is all full of relative truths and social constructions, and therefore all of science is wrong or bullshit, and therefore we can just make up whatever we want. Right? Biology doesn't exist. I can be a man or a woman or a unicorn. I can be anything I want to be. No, you can't. Genetics still determines you. Biology still runs you. Physiology still runs you. Chemistry still runs you. Physics still runs you, even though those are all social constructions. Gravity is a social construction, but that does not mean that you get to jump out of an airplane without a parachute and survive. So stage green tends to go overboard and make the mistake of thinking that, well, if gravity is socially constructed, that means I can just jump out of an airplane. No, you're just being stupid. Furthermore, there's this now prevalent notion that truth doesn't exist. Because everything is relative and everything is a social construction, there's no such thing as absolute truth. Absolute truth is a quaint idea that cannot survive in the postmodern era. This is wrong. Absolute truth absolutely exists. But wait a minute, Leo, how is that possible? If everything is relative and socially constructed, how can there be absolute truth? Well, that's way too deep of a topic to answer here. If you want to know more about that, go check out my episode called Relative versus Absolute Truth. Another episode I have is called What is Truth? Go check those out. There's also a tendency with this kind of relativism, excessive relativism, to consider all cultures and all value systems as equal. This is not true. All cultures and all value systems are not equal. All ethnicities and races are not equal. Men and women are not equal. Now, does this mean that we should treat men better than women? No. Does that mean we should treat whites better than blacks? No. Does that mean that we should hold American culture as better than Chinese culture? No. Cultures are very complex systems with many trade-offs and pros and cons to them. There are strengths and weaknesses to every culture. There are certain things that the Chinese culture is better at than American culture and vice versa. It's not so easy to figure out which parts are better at what things. That takes a lot of empirical investigation, testing, and research. And it's true that there's a lot of alternative ways to do the same thing, or as they say, there's many ways to skin a cat. So there's not just one way to run an economy. There's not just one best form of government. There's not just one best education system. There's not just one best way to do business. There are many. There's a diversity of different ways with various kinds of pros and cons and trade-offs. Stage Green can go overboard in trying to equalize all of these because Stage Green is so big on equality. Everything has to be equalized. Stage Green is bad at dealing with asymmetries. You have to be able to balance asymmetries, not to equalize everything across the board. Men and women are different. They're asymmetrical, but they can be balanced between themselves. See? So be careful about that. Another problem with Stage Green and leftism is leftists don't take seriously the problem of the loosening and coarsening of moral standards. Leftists tend to treat moral standards as some sort of quaint, hokey leftover from, our religious traditions, which are mostly just superstitions and outdated traditions. But actually, there is deep wisdom in our ancient religious traditions. And I don't even mean any kind of metaphysical sense. I just mean very practically. All the ancient religions give rules of conduct, ethical standards, norms, taboos, expectations, certain values, and habits that human beings are expected to follow in order to achieve greatness and the quote-unquote good life. So the question is, how do you achieve the good life? And then religion says, well, if you do X, Y, Z, you will achieve a good life. And if you don't do these things, if you do A, B, C, then you're going to fall into hell. And there's practical truth in this. Over the last 50 years, especially in American society, as we've been shifting away from religion into secularism and rationalism and materialism, things have been lost. Our culture and our moral standards have degraded. With things like weed, easy access to drugs, the use of profanity and vulgarity, the prevalence of porn, violent rap music, and these kinds of things, this does lead to a coarsening of our culture. Our children are becoming more spoiled with access to video games in unlimited quantities, with Netflix, with junk food, with television, with the internet, with social media, with Twitter, with Facebook, with Instagram. This is making people soft, complacent, lazy, and spoiled. And it is also contributing to the disintegration of the family unit. The traditional family unit is getting rotted out as well. These are not just quaint, hokey, fundamentalist concerns. This should concern everybody. If you're secular, if you're rational, if you're scientific, this should still all concern you, because these are practical matters of how your children are being raised and how you're being raised and how culture is influencing you. There are healthy cultures and unhealthy cultures. Healthy cultures, over time, if we're not careful, they degrade into vulgarity and unhealthy cultures. You know, it's amazing. Just go and look at an interview, like a news interview from 30 or 40 years ago, and compare it to a news interview of today. And it's kind of shocking. I was watching this video of an interview with Bruce Lee, the famous martial artist Bruce Lee. And it was amazing. It's like a 40-year-old interview. There was anything especially profound about it, but it was just amazing the tone with which he spoke, the sort of decorum he had, the kind of respect that he had towards the interviewer and the interviewer had towards him. There was a sort of like, I don't know, something in our culture has just gotten so debased. These days, people just drop F-bombs, and hey, you know, I'm totally guilty of this. But people just drop F-bombs. Everything has become so vulgar and profane. And just our whole culture has kind of like lost its dignity. It's like everything is being geared towards the lowest common denominator. And the things that Bruce Lee was saying in this interview he came off as so intelligent. I also watched another interview of Tom Cruise. This was an old interview of Tom Cruise when he did the first Top Gun movie. This was like 30 years ago or so. Maybe 40 years ago, a long time ago. The first Top Gun. But yeah, it was a short interview, but again, he came off, just the words he was using, his diction, his tone, he came off as just like so intelligent. It's amazing to watch some of these interviews. You can clearly see how our culture has degraded, our media has degraded in many ways. Now, in many ways, we've become more real. We've become less like proper. And that propriety was like more like of a front, you could say. But still, there was like dignity in that propriety that we've lost. And that's hurting us as a country. So conservatives are very concerned about this. They talk a lot about how, you know, rap music is degrading the culture. Now, in a certain sense, you hear that and you're like, oh, well, come on, get fucking real. You know, rap music is debasing the culture. Like, come on, get the stick out of your ass. You might say that. Or conservatives might say, oh, you know, weed is debasing the culture. And you might say, oh, come on, you know, stop being a square, man, and just smoke a bit of weed. You'll be fine. It's okay. Weed never killed anybody. In a certain sense, that's all true from the left-wing point of view. But also there's truth from the right-wing point of view. It is true that weed does debase our culture. It's also true that rap debases our culture. Rap is like a stage-read form of music. When people are singing about getting rich and stealing cars and wearing pinky diamond rings and getting tattoos and piercings and shooting others in drive-bys and how much money they have when they roll into the club with their Mercedes G-Wagon, and you know how many bitches are grinding on their cock and how wet their pussies are, and the kind of expensive champagne that they're drinking and the money that they're making rain. This does get into people's minds. This becomes our value system. The value system is no longer about truth and integrity and God and being a good human being and raising a good family and all this kind of. It's about fucking bitches and making money. This is a problem because young kids grow up with this attitude of fucking bitches and making money, and then you get stuff like, the Ty Lopez phenomena, the Andrew Tate phenomena, these slick entrepreneurs who are showing off their fucking Lambo in their garage kind of bullshit. This is what our culture has become. People actually see some dude in his fucking garage with a couple of Ferraris and Lambos and a few hot bitches and, a gold chain around his neck, and then they think that this is what they should aspire to, that this is what human life is about following that idiot. This is a problem. Widespread use of weed, psychedelics, drugs, porn, video games, alcohol does destabilize society and lead to disease and dysfunction. You have to admit this as a leftist. If you don't admit this, you're fooling yourself. Now, does this mean that we should lock people in jail for smoking some weed? No, of course not. Does this mean psychedelics should not be legalized and never used? Of course not. They need to be used in a proper setting, responsibly, using proper protocols, for proper purposes, not just for getting high. Does this mean we should abolish all porn? No, of course not. But our relationship to porn right now is quite toxic for many people. Same thing with video games. Does this mean that video games cause violence, as right-wingers like to say, and that we should get rid of video games? No, of course not. But you also have to admit that what has happened with video games lately, children are fucking video game addicts. Why don't guys know how to get laid? Because they spent 20 years of their childhood playing fucking video games and never talking to a single girl. It's not feminism that's preventing you from getting laid. It's all the fucking video games. Not to mention what video games do to your career and your ability to do business. A lot of guys can't even have a decent career because they wasted 20 years of their life, which they should have spent developing some kind of skill, marketable skills that could form the foundation of a career, like drawing, programming, engineering, mathematics, physics, chemistry. These would be skills you can develop. But instead, what do? They play fucking World of Warcraft for 1,000 hours every year. This is rotting our society. Traditional social structures have value to them. They've been field tested to work because they've evolved over hundreds of years. This needs to be respected. Leftists do not respect this nearly enough. Your utopian and idealistic ideas about how to change these social structures, these traditions, won't necessarily outperform the traditions because you're not as smart as hundreds of years of evolution and trial and error. Society is very complex, and any kind of social structure that is successful and effective needs to have gone through many iterations of trial and error, and they've had many unintended consequences. So when you as a leftist think that you can just come up with some sort of utopian public policy proposal, there's no guarantee that it's going to work. In fact, it could backfire and create something way worse. You think Marxism is going to replace capitalism and be better and eliminate poverty? That's your theory, but in practice, it might be the opposite of that. In practice, when you implement your Marxism, it might create more poverty than capitalism. That's something you need to acknowledge. That requires humility. So there is a sort of arrogance that comes with stage green and leftism where you think you can just socially engineer your way out of all these problems. For example, you might think that instating democracy in the workplace the way that Richard Wolff wants to do, turning corporations into cooperatives, you think that this will create for better, fairer work environments. That's your theory. But in practice, you have to wonder, What happens if you take all these big corporations and you turn them into cooperatives? Will this actually work? Will you actually be able to be competitive with all the other corporations in the world who are not cooperatives? Or will you not be competitive and your co-op will become spoiled and lazy and rotten, lacking vision and direction, and ultimately go bankrupt? And then all those employees will be out of a job, which will be worse than what they had under capitalism. Now, I'm not using this as an argument to say that we should not experiment with workplace democracy. I think we should. I think it's a good idea. I generally agree with Richard Wolff that workplace democracy is probably the best implementation of socialism or Marxism. However, I'm not at all convinced that removing all the hierarchy from our most competitive organizations and corporations and turning them into just these flat democratic systems is going to produce the same kind of productivity and competitiveness and innovation that they have now, and that such cooperatives and corporations will be able to survive and compete with everyone else in the world. Maybe it'll work, but we can't know that. We have to be humble and we have to understand that it needs to be tested. That's an empirical question. The next point for leftists is this: recognize that not all religion and spirituality is fundamentalist, stupid, and corrupt. There does exist something beyond secularism. Sometimes Sage Green gets the idea that secularism is the ultimate thing, and that religion and spirituality, that's just some fundamentalist, leftovers that we have already transcended. And then if you're an intellectual, then you just got to be secular and rational, and that's the end of the story. But that's not the end of the story. That's only half the story. The story continues beyond your secularism. Beyond secularism, you realize that fundamentally atheism, secularism, and rationalism are all fundamentally wrong. Fundamentally, Marx's materialism is also wrong. Marx took his materialism actually from Hegel. So, in Marxism, there's something called dialectical materialism, which Marx was inspired by Hegel, because Hegel was actually a much more intelligent guy than Marx. But Hegel was a lot harder to understand than Marx, a lot less practical than Marx. So Hegel was an idealist, not a materialist. Marx read Hegel, took his dialectical ideas, the thesis, antithesis, he took those kinds of ideas from Hegel, but then he didn't like the idealism, he threw away the idealism and he turned into materialism, and he thought that he was making an improvement on Hegel by turning Hegel into materialism. And then this materialist metaphysics has crept its way into modern times. And this is supposedly an advantage to Marxist economics, is that it's materialistic. No, this is a disadvantage. In fact, Hegel was right. Reality is not materialistic, it's idealistic. Materialism is wrong. You can verify this for yourself by doing some spiritual work. And so ultimately, Marx's whole metaphysics is wrong. The entire metaphysics of Marx's economics is wrong. So just keep that in mind. You Marxists who think you know everything about Marx. You might know everything about Marx, but you don't know the fundamental metaphysics is wrong. For more on that, see my other episodes about materialism and God and spirituality and so forth. I can't explain all that here. In general, leftists have this problem of making overly idealistic, unrealistic plans. Some of these plans might be like banning the sale of all gas cars. That's been happening in California lately, in certain other places, I think in Canada. They've actually set a timeline for the ban of the sale of all gas cars in California and in Canada to like 2035. I don't know what it is, something like that. Or, for example, banning all oil drilling. Stuff like this. These kinds of plans come from a good place. They come from a place of compassion, environmental concern. These are all valuable impulses and motivations. However, they can be very unrealistic. You have to be careful with that idiot compassion that I talked about in part 1. Idiot compassion is when you want to like save the whole world, but you're doing it in such a way that it's not actually going to work. So while you might care about the environment, if you ban the sale of all gas cars, you might actually create more problems for the environment in the long term. Because the reality is that if you're not able to actually get everyone onto an electric car, and then you ban the sale of all gas cars, this is going to create such a problem in our economy and for society that this will create more problems than just having gas cars. See? There's many kinds of examples like this that leftists can fall into. Next point, the banning of guns in America will not stop school shootings. This is a silly idea. There are so many guns in America that you're not going to be able to ban them. Also, the banning of assault rifles is not going to prevent mass murders because there's still going to be handguns. So unless you're talking about banning all handguns, which you could talk about that, but first of all, that would be grossly unconstitutional. It would piss a lot of people off. It would not be politically popular or acceptable. So it's basically a dead issue. But if you don't ban all handguns, then there's no way you're going to stop these school shootings. Just because assault rifles are the most popular gun that is used for school shootings and so forth does not mean that once you ban them that people won't switch to handguns or shotguns. They will. Of course they will. This is just obvious. So this sort of like rabid desire to ban assault rifles, this sounds good in theory, but in practice it's not going to work. Also, progressives are wrong. This is something that I was wrong about as a progressive until recently. I realized that and I changed my mind on this, is that guns can be legitimately used to stave off government tyranny. My thinking on this used to be that, well, the government has nukes and they have tanks and they have helicopters and they have Marines and Army and missiles. So how is the populace ever going to stand up to the government just with, some handguns and some rifles and some M16s? But the reality is that it can be done. The military is actually surprisingly not that powerful and effective when it comes to urban warfare. And so if worse came to worse, if the American citizenry actually wanted to challenge the government because the government becomes so corrupt or so tyrannical, it actually would be capable of doing this just through small arms. Not that this is a realistic scenario or that I think it would ever really be necessary, but just on this point, conservatives are right. You could do it. Just look at Afghanistan. Look at how effectively insurgents and the Taliban in Afghanistan, with just mostly small arms, were able to resist the U.S. military, which had much, much stronger firepower. So it's not about the firepower. It's really about the resolve. Who has more resolve? Who has the home field advantage, so to speak, which of course is always the insurgents. Who can fight using dirty tricks, shooting from windows and stuff like that, which is of course always the insurgents, because they have no rules of engagement. And in the end, it's just the size of the population. You have 300 million people. The army is not that big. It's only 1 million at most. Let's talk about pacifism. So this is where the left goes wrong as well. Sometimes the left goes into this sort of naive pacifism where they advocate for no military at all, or defunding the military, or scaling back the military budget by 90%, or the complete pullout of American forces from geopolitics all around the world. Stop being the world's policeman sort of logic, sort of isolationist logic. And all of this is wrong. Leftists tend to not appreciate the complexity of geopolitics and the necessity and importance of conflict and war and violence. The only reason you can have a country is because you have a military and because you're prepared to use that military and force and conflict to defend yourself. Now, ideally, we're going to evolve to a place in 1,000 years where none of that will be necessary. But today, the world we live in, it's necessary. So pacifism doesn't work today. Now, I'm all for minimizing war and conflict. And we should especially avoid unnecessary wars, frivolous wars, pointless wars like the war in Iraq or the war in Ukraine and so forth. The Vietnam War. These were largely unnecessary wars. On the other hand, there are legitimate wars, and there are legitimate reasons to fund the military. And furthermore, not just that, but there are legitimate reasons for geopolitical positioning. And it's very important what countries you ally yourself with and the kind of alliances you create, the kind of blocks you create, because this has impact on the economy, on trade, and on the possibility of future war. So geopolitical positioning, this is, a lot of this is about preventing war from breaking out. Now, of course, it can all be badly abused. And it has been badly abused by America and other countries. But it's just unrealistic to expect that all of this stops or to pull yourself out of this. America should not pull itself out of international geopolitics. This would not be a good idea, because in reality, what's going to happen is that somebody else would fill the vacuum. The vacuum would be filled either by Russia or by China or by Brazil or somebody else. And the reality is that those countries are less developed than America. So they would be more brutal and things would be worse off, generally speaking. Leftists don't really understand that not all war and violence is bad. Violence serves a legitimate function. The military holds a legitimate function. And I mean, serves a legitimate function. And also military spending has a special importance that leftists don't recognize. A leftist will say, well, you know, how come when it comes to funding some new war, all of a sudden we have the money for it? But when it comes to funding some education program or some prison program, we don't have the money for it. But if you think about this for a minute, you should realize that the military serves a very special function. It's the most fundamental function of a government, is its military, because without the military, there is no government. So actually, yes, when it comes to military funding, that has a higher priority, and therefore we find the money because it's a matter of life and death. Or at least it is in theory. Now, is it always a matter of life and death? No. Is the U.S. government military budget grossly overinflated? Probably. But also maybe not so much, because remember, we do serve as the world's policeman, which means we serve as the world's peacekeeper. Because if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Otherwise, you have global anarchy, and you have countries with lower stages of development serving as the policeman, or worse, as a bully. See, if the U.S. pulls out of being the world's policeman, Russia may take its place. Do you want Russia to be the world's policeman? Have you seen the police in Russia, how fucking corrupt they are? Think twice about that. If you let Putin, he'll become the world's mob boss. So to prevent that from happening, yeah, the US spends a lot of money on military. Appreciate what that gets you. That gets you a lot of economic goodies that you benefit from. Cheaper oil, cheaper food, cheaper clothing, and many other such things. In your own family's budgets, there's priorities. For example, you might not have enough money to go to a nice restaurant or even to buy a textbook for your child. You just may not have enough money. But when it comes to something like paying your rent, all of a sudden you find the money. Why is that? Because paying your rent is more important than food, is more important than your child's textbook. Why is that? Because if you don't pay the rent, they kick you out and then you're living on the street. It's kind of like that when it comes to finding money for the military. So leftists don't quite understand this. Because leftists have a bias against conflict and violence and war. They tend to think of all of it as bad because they're just such bleeding heart Care Bears and hippies. They just want to avoid violence at all costs. But see, here's the problem, is that when you avoid violence at all costs, this leaves you open to bullying from others. And counterintuitively, it could actually create more damage and more death. How so? Because if you put up a tough front and you have a strong military, most people won't want to fuck with you. If you dismantle your military and you become weak and soft, you become a target. And then actually more people want to start war with you. So you as a leftist, think about this. Your pacifism might end up backfiring on you because reality is much more complicated than you think. Just because you're going to be a pacifist does not mean that all the low, spirally developed countries around you are going to honor that or respect that. They're going to abuse that. Putin is going to abuse your pacifism. Think about that. Another problem for the left is excessive political correctness and cancel culture. I do believe there is some value in canceling some extremely toxic people. For example, I agree with the cancellation of Alex Jones. The kind of ridiculous things he was saying were so toxic and so misinforming that he needed to be canceled. But the left can go way too far with this. The left tends to become all too easily offended and triggered by things that are not very significant. Minor insults, jokes, vulgarity and crude things like this. People should not be canceled for this. So it's a problem when you're canceling people for making jokes. Sexist jokes, racist jokes, rape jokes. Yeah, I get that this is insensitive. It's insensitive to make a rape joke or a racist joke. I get that it hurts you, but that doesn't mean that somebody's entire career should be ended over this. If you think it should, just think about that. Again, why are you so sensitive? We need people to be tougher. It's not so much about making others nicer, it's about you becoming tougher. Become so tough that a rape joke doesn't offend you. Become so tough that a gay joke doesn't offend you. Become so tough that a racist joke doesn't offend you. If it does, look at how weak you are. You're so weak that words are violence to you. If words are your definition of violence, you really don't appreciate what violence is. And in this case, the right-wingers are right in calling you a snowflake. In a certain sense, leftists are snowflakes. Then again, a lot of the right wing are extreme snowflakes too. They're extremely offended, easily offended and triggered. It's so easy to offend and trigger a right-winger that they shouldn't be calling anyone a snowflake. The problem is that left-wingers are also easily offended and triggered. Another problem that I see with the left is in canceling others, they apply today's woke moral standards to figures of the past. This is silly. Our culture is evolving quite rapidly. And, 20 years ago, it was acceptable to make a gay joke. Today, it's not. Does that mean that if we find somebody who made a gay joke 20 years ago, he should be canceled? No. You have to understand that standards have changed. 40 years ago, wearing blackface was more or less acceptable. Today, it's not. Does that mean somebody should be canceled for wearing blackface 40 years ago? No. Is it wrong and insensitive and ugly to wear blackface? Yes, obviously. But you have to acknowledge that culture has changed a lot in the last 40 years. Also, if you see someone wearing blackface, don't fucking get offended by it. Now, I know that sounds like, Leo, who are you to say that? You're not black. You're not allowed to say that. But the reality is this, look, if somebody wearing some black fucking face paint gets you all riled up, that's more of your problem than it is anybody else's problem. Why are you allowing your mind to be so weak as to be offended by that? Now you might say, Leo, you're just gaslighting black people here. No. I fully recognize the evils of racism and the problems with that and the work that needs to happen on eliminating systemic racism. Totally agree with you on that. Let's work on that. But also, just on a sort of a human cultural level, stop being so fucking sensitive to little insults and offenses. This is not even like, I'm not saying this for my sake, I'm saying this for your sake, right? You want to be the kind of human who has the kind of mind that, like, it should take a lot to offend you. It should take a lot to rile you up, like something serious. Like if someone rapes your daughter, okay, get offended. Get riled up if someone rapes your daughter. If someone calls you a bad name or makes a crude joke about you, rise above that shit. The way you conquer that is by rising above it, not by engaging in some Twitter battle over who's the bigger victim. This is a problem that leftists tend to fall into. Right-wingers also didn't fall into this, so I'm not just picking on the left here. Next point. Leftists tend to overcompensate, which result in a lack of due process against rape and abuse allegations for men, which leads to mob outrage and mob justice. Rape is a serious issue and crime, and abuse, sexual abuse and physical abuse. These are serious issues and crimes, and women need to be heard when they make these accusations, and those need to be taken seriously. However, the pendulum can swing too much to the other direction, where allegations of rape or sexual abuse are made against some man, and then there's mob outrage. He gets canceled over it. There's no trial. There's no due process. And it's just a form of mob justice. This mob justice that we see on the left, this is problematic. Mob justice is not justice. So just be aware of that excess that can happen. Speaking of excess, stage green can become excessively environmental. You become so concerned over the environment and protecting the environment that you forget the human suffering that comes with being overly concerned about the environment. You can be so protectionist over some environmental issue that you fail to see the human suffering that is caused by not allowing business and man to just exhaust that environment, I guess you could say. It doesn't sound very nice, but ultimately, like, when it comes to the Amazon rainforest, yeah, it's nice to preserve the Amazon rainforest, but also you have to wonder, when it comes to preserving the Amazon rainforest, what's happening there is that the situation in Brazil is so dire that people can barely feed themselves. So when they're logging that forest, they're creating space for farming, for example. Cattle and other sorts of agriculture. That actually feeds people. So while it's not nice to see the rainforest in Brazil getting cleared, you also have to kind of like look at the other side of the issue. It's like, but the clearing of the rainforest actually helps feed millions of children who otherwise would be hungry. How do you balance those two out? Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but you have to start to see both sides of that. Environmental regulation does raise prices on food, on gas, on various commodities and services. And hey, I'm all for environmental regulation. I think it's very important. I think climate change is a serious issue. Green energy is important. All this kind of stuff is important. But also you have to understand that it's not just evil businesses that are reaping profits and destroying the environment. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's that businesses are exploiting the environment in order to allow many millions of humans to survive easier. By providing them cheaper food, cheaper gas, and other technologies. Now, is there also excessive corporate profits and greed in there too? Yes, of course there is. Of course, there's always corruption in any system. But you have to be careful that your compassion for the environment doesn't make it such that actually you're causing the suffering of millions of people on the other side. Those need to be balanced out. So it's mostly just a matter of balance. Another issue with leftists is you have to be careful about having excessive regulation, red tape, and bureaucracy. There needs to be some kind of mechanism for reducing laws and excessive regulations. It can't just be that we're always adding new regulations every year on top of more regulations every year forever, with no mechanism for removing old ones that no longer make sense. Because then we just get bogged down in endless red tape. Leftists also need to be careful with affirmative action programs. I think there's some room for affirmative action programs, but they can also get excessive. And you have to be careful in how it pisses people off. The more affirmative actions programs you do, basically with affirmative action programs, what you're doing is you're saying, we have a situation that's unequal. Now we want to help to equalize that situation. And we're going to do that by passing some sort of program that kind of helps the unequal side rise to parity with the equal side. That's essentially what affirmative action is doing. But the problem is that in order to correct this imbalance, you're actually creating an imbalance to correct an imbalance. But that imbalance you're creating, that is an imbalance. So you'd have to keep that in mind, because in the end, what you want is balance, not imbalance. So the question is, when do your affirmative action programs go too far, or when do they need to be turned off once the correct balance has been struck? That's a very nuanced issue. There's no easy answer there. Another criticism I would have of the left is on the abortion issue. Completely unrestricted abortion, very late-term abortion. This presents a problem. The majority of people are not going to agree with you on that. You can make all the fine arguments you want about when is a life really a life, when is a baby really a baby or a human, when should it have rights, when does it suffer, all this kind of stuff. You can argue that till the cows come home, but ultimately, when we're talking about very late-term abortions, this is going to be repugnant, morally repugnant to the majority of mankind. Now, I know that you can make all sorts of scientific and medical arguments like, well, Leo, nobody just does a late-term abortion just for the, just because they don't want the baby. It's usually because there's complications, because the mother's life is at risk and all that. Fine. You can make all those little nuanced distinctions, but ultimately, you're not going to win morally on this issue of late-term abortions. And you're kidding yourself if you think you are. It would be better to come to a compromise on this issue. Really, Roe versus Wade struck a pretty good compromise. But still, I don't think leftists should push this too far. I think leftists should be happy to compromise with conservatives on this issue of abortion and just say something like, look, first 2 trimesters, abortion is legal. Third trimester, it's illegal unless there's extenuating circumstances, unless serious threat to the mother's life, or serious, genetic defects are found in the baby, in the fetus, in which case maybe the abortion is okay. But otherwise, no late-term abortions. This would be, I think, a reasonable compromise that would leave most people happy. And I think leftists make a mistake when they just want completely unrestricted abortions. It's just a bad image. It's a bad PR image, even if you can justify it by saying that, oh, the very late-term abortions are only going to be the ones that are medically necessary because the majority of abortions are done like in the first trimester. It's still a bad image politically, I think. Of course, the left goes wrong anytime it commits violence. Violent protests, violent riots, Antifa, the kind of stuff that Antifa does, this is all a detriment to the left. It makes the left look bad, and it just empowers the right. So that should be pretty obvious to most leftists. Another problem with the left is I heard this actually from somebody from Scandinavia. I was talking to him about, how does he like living in Scandinavia? I forget which Scandinavian country he was from, but I was kind of asking about his, I'm like, oh, you guys are supposed to have good welfare systems and a good social safety net and free healthcare. How do you like it? And he said, overall, I like it. But the one thing I don't like about it is that there's a sort of a culture of cutting down the tallest flowers. Anybody basically like in the Scandinavian school system who tries to be a little bit too ambitious, who tries to exert their power and tries to rise above and be unique and be special and be extraordinary, they get cut down. Because culturally, it's like, it's looked down upon. It's like, don't draw too much attention to yourself. Don't try to be too different. Don't try to, be too competitive. Don't try to be too creative. Just kind of do what the herd is doing. When I heard this concerned me. And so I think that is a legitimate concern with these sort of more socialistically inclined Scandinavian countries. Their culture is basically that, you shouldn't be too competitive. And if you achieve a level of success beyond the norm, they're just going to cut you down at the knees. This is called cutting down the tallest flowers. So you leftists should be careful about that kind of attitude creeping into your organizations and the economy and society at large. I think that would be a problem. Another mistake that leftists make is trying to bring stage green values into places like Iraq or Afghanistan or other parts of the world that are not developed enough to sustain it. For more on this, you can see my episodes on spiral dynamics where I talk about the problems with trying to impose one value system on another value system that is not ready for it. But basically, the only countries in the world that are really ready for stage green are going to be stage orange countries. You can't take a country like Saudi Arabia, which is stage red and blue, and try to impose stage green values on it. This is the problem of for example, when leftists criticize Saudi Arabia or the Middle East for forcing their women to wear headscarves and hijabs. From a stage green value system, it seems like this is barbaric, what's happening in Saudi Arabia. But that's just how it looks from the green value system. You have to recognize that from their value system, stage blue and red, it's a whole different world. And you should not try to impose your value system onto a country that is so far removed from it that it's going to take them hundreds of years to evolve to stage green. And this is part of the reason why democracy failed, for example, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And why after the US pulled out from Afghanistan, the Taliban immediately took over, like the US was never even there, and forced all the women out of school and forced all the women to wear headscarves and hijabs and stuff. Because Afghanistan is spiral dynamic stage purple and red. What do you expect of them? Their green value system, and then you know, like stage green valued feminists in America and in Europe are like in shock about this. Like, oh my God, what about the little girls in Afghanistan? Dude, the way that those kind of cultures treat women, they treat women as property. That's how women are treated in that culture, in that value system. You can't just go in there and impose your value system on them. It's not going to work. There is no feminism in Afghanistan. Forget about feminism. It doesn't exist at that stage of development. A lot of liberals and progressives don't understand this. Another minor criticism that I have of the left is that they sometimes criticize and dismiss the importance of space exploration. They'll make the argument that, like, you know, we have so many people suffering on this planet that why are we wasting money exploring space when we could put all that money into feeding the hungry and the poor? I understand that criticism, but I think that also there's an important function to space exploration. It's not purely frivolous. Mankind needs some sort of higher aspiration beyond merely the petty human shit that is happening on this planet. And I think space exploration fills that void very nicely. Space exploration is almost like one of those things that we can all kind of agree on, in the sense that it's like it's almost like our highest aspiration as a species is to grow beyond planet Earth. And it's just one of those aspirational things that make you feel good about mankind. You know, when you're reading articles about some new space launch or some new space telescope or some new planet that's been discovered, or pictures of some distant galaxy, this fills you with awe, with almost a sense of divine purpose. It's almost like the most religious that our secular society gets is when we get pictures of space. It puts us into a larger context and perspective. All the wars and petty bullshit that we deal with here, all of that loses its importance next to a photograph of the Milky Way galaxy or something like that. And so I think that that's valuable. And the amount of money we spend on it is relatively trivial for what we get back culturally. Not to mention the technology that also gets invented from pushing ourselves into space. The next criticism I have of the left is just the constant complaining, criticizing, and whining of the left becomes very grating and annoying after a certain point. This ingratitude, fundamentally, is what it is. Nothing is ever good enough for the left. Even when we pass a tax increase, even when there's a new stimulus package, even when we pull out of some war like Afghanistan, even when something good is done for the hungry, for the poor, even when we pass stricter gas regulations and stuff like that, like, it's never good enough for progressives. Never. Never. This is a bad attitude. It's a kind of a demoralizing, ungrateful. It's just not a good way to go through life. You're never going to be happy. Do you understand this? As a progressive, you're basically never, ever going to be happy in your whole life. You're going to be bitching, moaning, and whining that society is not good enough for your whole life until you're dead. Now ask yourself, is that a good way to live life? Maybe the problem isn't that society isn't advanced enough for you. Maybe the problem is that you expect society to be more advanced than it really should be. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem isn't society. Maybe the problem is you. Has that crazy idea ever crossed your mind? Maybe you want something of society that it can never give you. This can lead to a sort of culture of victimhood and weakness. Look, in the end, at the era we're living in, we're living in the dark ages, basically. The 21st century will be known as the dark ages of mankind, thousands of years from now. Yes, it's barbaric, it's brutal, it's cruel, it's unfair. It's got racism and homophobia in it and transphobia, and it's got genocide, and it's got all sorts of ugly stuff. And in a certain sense, your job is to accept that and to be tough enough to deal with all of that and to not be a crybaby about it. Now, does that mean you capitulate and you don't stand up against bullies and you don't fight against slavery and racism when they exist? And you don't speak up against rape and abuse of homosexuals? No, of course you do. You fight these things. You go to the ballot box. You vote on the right issues, right? You can do all those things, but just don't get sucked into this kind of mindset and this culture of just this perpetual victimhood and this kind of weakness and just being so sensitive about everything, so ungrateful about everything, and just whining constantly about everything. This is not good for you. And this is not a resourceful attitude from which to build the kind of great society that we want to build to. Remember that society and people can only develop so fast. And if you're progressive, they're never going to develop as fast as you want them to. But you have to be mature about that, because it's almost like you have a child who's a little bit mentally retarded. And this child is going to school and going through his classes and so forth. And you as the parent, you're never satisfied, because in your mind, you always expected that you would have like a genius child with an IQ of 140. But actually, in reality, you happen to have a child who has an IQ of like 90. He's a little on the slow side. So he struggles with figuring out his schoolwork. And every time he comes home, you yell at him and you berate him and criticize him for not getting good enough grades and not being smart enough. Is that a wise attitude? No, at some point, you have to accept that your child is a little bit slower than the other kids, and that this is just the nature of the beast. And you not accepting this is not going to help the situation. You constantly complaining to your child about his slowness is not going to make him fast. In fact, it's going to make him hate you and resent you. And it's going to just make the whole thing worse. In a sense, that's what's happening with progressives and society. Our society is mentally retarded. And you have to accept that. That's difficult to accept, that we live in the dark ages in a mentally retarded society with a bunch of morons. But that's the case. And you have to live with these morons. You can't kill these morons. So you might as well make peace with it. But at the same time, you don't accept all the stupid stuff they tell you. You encourage them and you do the best to help them move forward and to see the light, but also you don't lose your shit over it either. You see, it's a delicate balancing act there. I want you to acknowledge that the right wing has valid concerns when it comes to immigration, taxation, abortion, and the debasement of culture. Now, does the right wing exaggerate all these things? Yes, of course it does. But I want you to recognize that there's some validity there. Now we're getting into some very general final points about the left. Final mistakes that they make. Like, for example, overly demonizing stage blue and stage orange. That's just a very fundamental mistake that the left makes. Because that's a very fundamental mistake that stage green makes. Another mistake they make very generally is not fully embodying and exploring the lower stages of the spiral. Stage green tends to get locked into itself and demonizes the lower stages and not really embody them, even in your own personal life, which leads to misunderstanding and confusion and problems. It leads to a lopsided development. You should appreciate that most humans have a lot of work to do to integrate just the values of stage blue and orange. Most Americans are struggling to develop healthy stages blue and orange. Never mind green. They're not yet ready for green. And I would go even further to say that if you think you are at stage green, if you're a progressive leftist, socialist, Marxist, and so forth, I guarantee you that you have not fully embodied stage blue and orange, and that it would be in your best interest to do so. There are important developmental lessons that you're missing from blue and orange. I also want to caution you to be very careful about straw-manning conservatives. I see this so often with progressives. Just straw man after straw man after straw man of conservatives. Try to steel man conservatives. Try to really understand their worldview and where they're coming from, and try to find the signal in all their noise. Conservatives create a lot of fucking noise, but there is signal there that you're missing. And I also want you to take responsibility for your contribution to the political polarization that's happening right now. It's not merely the right-wingers who are creating this crazy polarization in American politics. It's also the extreme left wing. Acknowledge that. And my final criticism of stage green is that stage green creates a shadow out of capitalism, greed, ethnocentrism, racism, war, violence, religion, nationalism, corporations, guns, traditional morality, exploitation of the environment, and masculinity. You've likely created shadows out of these, and this is a problem. You need to integrate these shadows so that you can develop to your highest potential. All right, so those were all the points. Now some final remarks to sum all this up. Now, obviously not all leftists suffer from all the problems that I listed above. I listed a lot of problems. That's a long list. There's a wide range of maturity and level of development among leftists. Some leftists are very immature and childish. Other leftists are very mature. So we can't paint them all with one brush. If you take a big picture meta view, a systems view, you'll recognize that obviously the right wing cannot be 100% wrong. If the right wing was 100% wrong, they wouldn't exist. They exist because there's some kernel of truth to their worldview. There is value in the right-wing worldview. So you have to ask yourself, what are the legitimate functions of the right wing? If you say to yourself, there are no functions that are legitimate, then that's how you know you're fooling yourself. The right wing has legitimate functions, even though a lot of times the right wing goes crazy overboard to the point where you might think that it's completely detached from reality and has no value whatsoever. Now, despite all the limitations of the left wing that I've mentioned here in this series, the left is still more developed and more reasonable, generally speaking, than the right. The extreme right is more toxic and more dangerous than the extreme left at this point in human history. Now, maybe in the future this will change, but right now, that is my assessment. If you think I'm biased, well, that's your opinion. But I think I'm being objective when I say that. Now, you might say, Leo, but why should we listen to you on all this? Aren't you just biased? Aren't all these just your biases? in reality, I'm not loyal to any side or ideology. That's one thing you can count on from me, is that I never have a loyalty to any one group. I don't have a loyalty to any country, to any race, to not even to humanity itself. I've never had loyalties to any kind of group. I'm very allergic to any kind of group affiliation or identity. What I care about is pure understanding and perspective. So really, I'm just offering you more perspective than you've had as a leftist. I'm one of the most open-minded people that you'll find on this planet. I think open-mindedness is a superpower, and I can teach you this superpower. And that's part of why I was able to create this episode, this series of episodes, is because I am so open-minded that I'm able to see beyond my own biases and my own political inclinations. I do have very progressive political inclinations, but that doesn't mean I'm blinded by them to the point where I can't see beyond them. There's a lot of value of looking beyond your own political inclinations. I want you to understand that both the left and the right are not that developed. They both make a lot of mistakes. They're both very biased. And they both fail to appreciate how complex and challenging government is. Figuring out the right government is so difficult. Most people have no idea. It's important that leftists and progressives have an accurate understanding of the conservative worldview and not just strawmans. Why? Because the wrong understanding is guaranteed to create problems. Think of it like this, like you have a bad relationship with your spouse, so you two go into marriage counseling. What's the first thing that's going to happen in marriage counseling? The most fundamental solution is to get both of you to sit down and to listen to each other's points of view in good faith. Because if you go in there and you say, oh, my wife, she's a bitch, she's a whore, and she cheats on me, and she's always wrong, and she's evil, and she's stealing money, and all this kind of stuff, if that's how you go in there, and then your wife goes in there and says the exact kind of same things about you, there's no way that can be healed. That's a divide that cannot be healed. You need to be able to go in there and listen to your wife's grievances about you. As difficult as that is, listen to her grievances in good faith. That means when she's telling you all the things she doesn't like about what you're doing, or that offends her or disturbs her, you're not sitting there demonizing her in your mind. You're actually taking her seriously. And then she has to do the same thing for you. And then there's a possibility of healing this marriage. Well, you know, a marriage isn't even as bad as our political situation, because in a marriage, there's always the option to just get a divorce. People go their separate ways and life is happily ever after, right? Things are fine. You can find happiness after divorce, but there can't be a divorce in America. So it's a more strict situation. We're forced to figure out how to live together. We can't kick out half the country. We can't kill half the country. And if we separate the country into two countries, then both will be very weak and they will be conquered by external enemies. In the future, I'm going to have 2 new episodes, one that's going to focus on understanding the conservative mind and one that's going to focus on understanding the liberal mind. Those are going to be powerful episodes, so stick tuned for those. And make sure you go watch my 4-part series called Conscious Politics. If you want an explanation of what, I said fourth way politics, stage yellow politics, meta politics, politics beyond the left-right spectrum and beyond centrism. What does that look like? Go check out my series. Search for it on YouTube. It's called Conscious Politics. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please come check out Actualized.org. That's my website down below. There's a link. You will find resources on the website. You'll find my blog. You'll find my book list. You'll find political books on my book list. You'll find my life purpose course. You'll find the Actualized forum and other resources that are available for you there. If you'd like, you can support me at patreon.com/actualized with some donations. I thank you for those. And here's the final thing that I'll leave you with. It's this. The reason I talk about politics is because unbiased tier 2 discussions of politics are so rare. This channel is one of the few sources on the internet where you will hear tier 2 political discussion. So I feel it's my duty to offer that because it's so rare. I'm one of the few people who can do it. Now, there's a few others, but it's pretty rare. Also, one of my missions is to get people to stop being ideological, to get out of groupthink, to stop demonizing others, and to do politics from tier 2, and to see radical points of view. That's my bias. That's why I teach this stuff the way that I do. Also understand that my work is so advanced and takes so much open-mindedness that it really cannot exist in a closed-minded political system. When people are arguing with each other, demonizing each other, fighting with each other, being overly partisan, my work cannot work. My spiritual work cannot work. So I sort of need to help to carve out a space for this kind of work to be possible at all. And also the ability to see radically different perspectives than your own is core to my work. That's why politics is so interesting to me, because politics presents a real-world practical application of all the kind of open-mindedness and multi-perspectivalism that I teach in my epistemic episodes. Well, politics allows you to kind of really test how good are you at seeing radically different perspectives than your own. This is the real test. I'm one of the few people on this planet who can teach you how to see radically different perspectives than your own. Because that's just something that's a core value of mine that I'm very passionate about. I break and rack my mind around how to see radically different perspectives than my own, and I can help you to do the same, but only if you have the desire to do so, which I hope that you do. And if you do, then you found exactly the right channel. Subscribe and stick around for more, where we will cover many other tools and ways of thinking about reality that will show you crazy, radical new perspectives.